Hi Vix, how you doing today? How is work going? How is a day in the life of Vix going? I read this through about 12 times. There's probably still mistakes, but yeah, that's the nature of life. I also tried to turn off the sound alerts. Hopefully that worked. I don't know if all of this content will make it to the 8 o'clock mark when Tifa is supposed to start streaming Layton, but I wanted to start now before my tea ran out and I completely lost energy. So I don't know how long I'll be talking about this, but I have no idea how much content is here. Dog is drinking water, as he has to do. Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Harold, for participating. Good job. Good job. Yeah. Yeah. Anything you want to say to the people? Huh? Anything you want to say? No? Nothing you want to say? Nope. Maybe? Good boy. Yeah, good boy. Good boy. I forgot to turn off Kappa, but that'll just be how it is. Okay, so in the previous lectures on Japanese history, we talked about the Jomon up through the Heian periods. But that was so long ago that I figured you guys don't really remember. I mean, I barely remember. So we'll start with a little bit of the conversation of Heian so that people understand like where the Kamakura stuff is coming from. And then we'll work through these subsequent periods. And hopefully we'll get to the Reiwa period today. Hopefully we'll get there. Okay. Again, I have two computers going here, so I have to got one computer with the notes, one computer with the pictures. So hopefully this works. My dog is disturbed that I'm talking to myself. It's okay. Yeah, it's okay. I'm just a little bit crazy. It's okay, you're not late. We just started. Welcome in. Dr. Leo and Fanfic, thank you for coming in today. My dog has to start whining now, apparently. So we were just talking about the previous time that we talked about Japanese history. We got up through the Heian period. We went from Jomon to the Heian period. But I'm going to assume no one remembers that much. So we're going to talk about the Heian period a little bit before we get into the Kamakura period. And then we'll try to reach to the Reiwa today. Why are we whining? Why are we whining? Why are we whining? He wants to go into the other room where the cat food is. Why? Why? Why, dog? Why? Okay, so here we have a woodblock print by Tokugawa Yoshitora. It's called The Great Battle Between the Minamoto and the Taira. And this is, you know, relevant to our time period that we begin with, the Heian period. So it was relatively peaceful, but all good peace times come to an end, as they do. outside the capital and the provinces, powerful military forces were developing. They were typically led by minor nobles. Oftentimes, these minor nobles were sent on behalf of court-based major nobles to carry out like tedious local administrative duties or to put out flames of rebellion. So basically, and this was particularly true in the northeast of Japan, which was the very edge of the court's sphere of influence. Like, nobody wanted to go there. If you got a governor assignment, you know, you were supposed to be the governor administrator of these sort of out in the middle of nowhere places, oftentimes you would just send someone else, essentially. That's what would happen. So I'm trying to adjust the camera here, but it's not working. Thank you. I'm just gonna look the wrong way, apparently. So some of the distant imperial family members barred from succession claims. So basically, you know, they were part of the imperial family, but they weren't allowed to actually take the throne at any point or participate in the imperial family activities. Oftentimes they... Why are you whining? Why are you whining? 1 minute. 1 minute. Harold. Someone is being naughty today. And not just Hebby. Welcome in, Hebby. Thank you for coming in. My dog is whining and he wants treats and attention, so we'll distract him a little bit. So if you were these types of nobles who were not allowed to have any claims to the throne, you were often given new names and sent off to these other provincial clans, and basically, you know, they were like, get rid of you, you know. So obviously those types of nobles would also be hostile to the court. Oh yeah, you've been here the whole time? Sure. I believe you. So there were two prominent and increasingly influential clans of these disenfranchised lesser nobles. And they are the Minamoto, also known as the Genji, and the Taira, also known as the Heike. And they did not like each other. In 1156, they were employed to help rival claimants to the Fujiwara leadership, basically the people who were controlling the throne, the clan that was controlling the throne. But these figures soon faded into the background when an all-out civil war developed between the Minamoto and the Taira. And this is referred to as the Genpei War, and that is a battle of the Genpei War is what you see in this woodblock print. So images of battles are pretty common in Japanese art. This is not the last one you're going to see from me. So don't be surprised when they keep coming. So let's see here. So our main guy of interest is Kiyomori. So the Taira prevailed under their leader Kiyomori, and you see an image of him here. Again, this is a woodblock print. And he based himself in the capital of Heian, clearly displaying to us like who had the real power during this time period. Over the following 20 years, he became overly absorbed in courtly politics, though, and society. In 1180, he enabled the enthroning of his 2-year-old grandson, Antoku, as emperor. This may sound familiar because we were talking about this when we ended last time. So basically, he's, instead of like letting the imperial family kind of, you know, stay enthroned, he starts putting his own family members on the throne. And when a rival claimant requested the help of the Minamoto clan to get the throne for himself, the Minamoto had basically spent 2 decades, regrouping and getting ready to, defeat the Taira. They were ready to help this rival claimant. Their leader at this time was Yoritomo. Both Kiyomori and the claimant died shortly afterwards, but Yoritomo and his half-brother Yoshitsune continued the military campaign against the Taira. By 1185, there goes my cat, Heian had fallen, and the Taira had been pursued to the western tip of Honshu. So things are going well for the Minamoto. So a famous naval battle ensued, and you saw an image of that previously in the previous slide. And this is a very famous battle called Dan no Ora, and it was won by the Minamoto. So in a well-known tragic tale, Kiyomori's widow leapt into the sea with her grandson Antoko, now aged 7, instead of surrendering to the Minamoto clan. So there's a very famous text called the Tale of the Heike, and it tells all about the Genpei War, not exactly in historically accurate terms, much more in a legendary kind of epic terms, but still it's very educational and informative in many ways. And we're really getting into a time period where we have, of course, things written down and a lot more history for us to study. So this was compiled prior to 1330, so, basically we're talking about, not that far along. It wasn't like it was compiled in, 1980, and it gives us a great insight into this time period. It's also an important source of many artworks, and related literature as well, which we will probably, bring up in the future. The Tale of Heike may come up quite often. So moving on. So that brings us to the Kamakura period, and it is interesting. So the Kamakura period was marked by a gradual shift in power from the nobility to land-owning military men in the provinces. This era was a time of dramatic transformation in the politics, society, and culture of Japan. So at this point, the Minamoto effectively have control over Japan and who gets enthroned. The Taira completely defeated, and the most powerful person among them is Yoritomo, who even had his own half-brother killed, Yoshitsune. He was like, well, this might be a threat to my own power, so he had him killed, among many other potential rivals. And this is something that frequently happens in Japanese history, where anyone who goes against your ideas, they are killed. Oftentimes their whole family is killed, that kind of thing. This is not like an anomaly. That's the word I want to use. It's not an anomaly. So most of us would assume that when Yoritomo came into power, he would then declare himself to be emperor, but that's not usually how things worked in Japan. So here is a seated portrait, a sculpture of who we believe to be Minamoto no Yoritomo, and you can see this at the Tokyo National Museum. But typically, this is not how it would work. You wouldn't name yourself emperor. Usually in Japan, the real powerhouse is someone pulling the strings of a puppet emperor or empress. And this structure, this sort of strategy, muddies the waters of who you're supposed to overthrow or kill in order to gain real power, right? Like, if you killed the emperor, there's just going to be someone else to go into that position, and you're not really killing the person in power. So it's kind of a weird board game of, like, who do I assassinate in order to actually restructure the government. It becomes very difficult, which is purposeful. So to this end, Yoritomo forced the new emperor to legitimize his authority by conferring on him the title Sei-tai Shogun, which essentially translates to Commander-in-Chief of Barbarian Subjugation, or Shogun for short. So a lot of you have probably heard the word Shogun. So this title was granted in 1192 to Yoritomo. it was an old title, so it was kind of like harking back to the ye old times. So it basically like justified its existence. It wasn't new. Like this is something that had existed before, so that means like he can be it, right? It was once assigned to 8th century generals who were supposed to prevent the borderlands from becoming overrun by invaders, aka barbarians, you know. So it's this idea of you're like protecting the state. You're supposed to have military power and you're protecting the state. But, you know, for Yoritomo, it was a little bit more advanced than that. So here we have 2 more works of art that are created during the Edo period, but they're really looking back to this sort of Kamakura time period, the medieval Japanese period, where we are beginning to see the samurai take power. And we'll talk more about the samurai as we continue today. So it's really going, the power, who has power over the country is really going more and more towards the military and generals. But Yoritomo was not just a military leader. He basically had the name of a military leader, but he was basically the de facto ruler of Japan and a dictator. Shoguns ruled Japan for most of the years between 1185 and 1868. So that is a long time period. The shogun's officials were referred to as the bakufu, which translates to tent government. In other words, like a military tent for a military campaign. So the idea is like a temporary government, as my dog makes a ton of noise. I don't know why he needs to make a lot of noise today, but he's really excited about Japanese history. But of course, it's not a temporary government. I mean, it's basically lasted until 1868, right? So they carried out the actual duties of government administration while also controlling the militia, aka the Jito or samurai. Like the older name for samurai is Jito. And the imperial court retained only nominal authority. So the idea was that the emperor was in charge, but he really wasn't. So why is this period called the Kamakura? Yoritomo decided he wouldn't do what Kiyomori had done. So Kiyomori had settled in Heian, and he had tried to slowly wheedle his way into controlling the court and the throne, but Yoritomo was like, the heck with that idea. It did not work out well for Kiyomori. Instead, he left the many existing offices and institutions that are already in place at Heian, and he set up a whole other capital for himself in the Bakufu in his home territory of Kamakura, which is outside of modern Tokyo. So that's where the name comes from. So instead of like trying to usurp the power structure that's already sitting in place in the imperial capital, he was like, I'm just going to make a whole second one that I'm completely in control of, and you guys can like think that you're still in charge even though you're not, and I'm not going to mess with your jobs or your positions or your titles or anything, but I'm going to have this whole other capital, which is the actual ruling capital. So in theory, he's meant to just be in charge of the military branch, but he is in charge of everything, and in practice he, held the power. So as throughout time and in any location on this planet, he who controls the military controls the state, or she who controls, or whatever gender you want to use there. Whoever controls the military controls the state. This is when feudal Japan gets its start. The Bakufu and the Hojo clan, which is Yoritomo's wife's clan, who succeeded him after his death. He didn't really live that long, so then his wife's clan, the clan was very powerful, the Hojo clan, took over, essentially. And they laid the groundwork for the loyalty-based lord-vassal system that would rule Japanese politics and society for the next 7 centuries. So with very few exceptions, the emperor would now largely be a symbolic ruler. We will talk about a couple of those exceptions, one in particular. So this is really the beginning of the time period of like the idealization and the romanticization of the military kind of, fighting spirit of Japan, samurai, warriors and that kind of stuff. And you may be wondering, well, why is there a samurai woman here in this image? There were female samurai, and they did actually fight. They did participate in battles and that kind of stuff. It's not really something that is, like, talked a lot about, you know, or really, I don't want to say advertised is the right word, but, you know, the average human being doesn't realize that there were samurai women who would fight on the battlefield and that kind of stuff. So that may be something. There's a couple, you know, famous names and a couple of famous stories, but it's not really something that really was written a lot about. But maybe I can bring some of those things up in future lectures. But it's important to know that, like, it wasn't just men. It was really, like, whole families. You'd have whole samurai families. Instead of just, like, the head of the household is the samurai. Okay. Moving on. Moving right along. Footloose and fancy free. So, although this is a... Oh, there's my mouse floating over here. Okay. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Go over here. Alright. So, although the Kamakura shogunate would be short-lived, it is very influential, right? This is something that is obviously going to be continued until the mid-1800s. It's just not always going to be Yoritomo's family. It's not going to be the Hogu clan. So what happens is the Mongols, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, and at the height of their power, reached Korea in 1259. And they then sent envoys to Japan seeking Japanese submission. So essentially, Kublai Khan sent over people that said, you know, we're in charge over here, and you need to bow to us. You need to submit to us. You need to, like, send us gifts and recognize that we're in charge, right? And Yoritomo was like, no way. I'm not gonna bow to you. I'm not gonna submit to you. I'm not your vassal. You're not my lord, right? And that really didn't go over well with the Mongols. The Mongols did not agree with that idea. So the diplomatic envoys from the Mongols were expelled from Japan, and then the Mongols sent a fleet to invade the southern island of Kyushu in 1274, as basically like, well, you didn't bow to us, so I guess we have to come over and we have to invade Japan. Welcome. So remember, Korea really isn't that far away from Japan, so they come right over from Korea. So there's this attack in 1274, and then there's a second, more determined attack in 1281, and they were really only barely repulsed after these, like, timely typhoon storms, which are called kamikaze or divine winds, destroyed much of the Mongol fleet. So if they didn't sort of stupidly decide to come during typhoon season, the Mongols may have invaded Japan and actually may have won. They may have colonized Japan or annexed Japan. So Japanese history may be very different if they didn't just have these two typhoons which destroyed much of these Mongol fleets. It's just very interesting. And that's why they're called, like, divine winds, right? Because they're divine miracles. So the Japanese believed the winds were sent by the gods, right, to defend their homeland. So despite having held off the Mongol invasion, the shogunate suffered, right? You think, okay, you managed to make sure the Mongols didn't come over to Japan. Like, that's pretty impressive. But previously, war was between clans, right? You beat up and killed your neighbors and then took their stuff, making your own family better off. But defeating and slaughtering the Mongols didn't give the warriors anything, and you can see the storm image here. One of the defeats of the Mongols, and the one in 1281, right? The ships are destroyed. They want to kill all the Mongol people. Thank you, Heavy, for hanging out as long as you could. They don't want any survivors. They don't want to risk anyone having any, you know, power over Japan, so there's nothing to take from this battle, right? You have no land that you've won, you have no riches, you have no servants, you have no slaves, you have nothing as actual, like, winnings, essentially. So the shogunate had nothing to pay the warriors with. Like, typically you would take stuff from other people and then you would give it to the warriors that had fought for you. But this caused considerable discontent because there was nothing to give. And the few payments the shogunate did manage to hand out depleted its own resources immensely. You know, and a lot of history is determined by, like, who has money, of course, right? So that's one of the images that we see of the Mongols being defeated by the storm. Again, this is a woodblock print, and this is a very common image in a lot of Japanese art, because obviously it's like very meaningful for the Japanese people. Okay, so this weird dude is Emperor Godaiko. So dissatisfaction toward the Kamakura regime culminated under the influence of the unusually assertive Emperor Godaiko, who basically his dates are 1288 to 1339. So he wanted to go back to the old days of sole imperial rule, i.e. like the emperor is in charge and there's no shogun, right? So in 1333, following a failed coup that saw him offered off into exile. So he attempted a coup, it failed, they put him into exile, but then he managed to raise an army while in exile, and then he toppled the government, and then he returned political authority to Heian Kyo. Did this last? Well, you can probably guess that the answer is no, right? Because we already discussed how the shogun really has power for many, many centuries. So that is the painting of him, Emperor Godaiko. And that brings us into the Nambukocho. There we go, Nambukocho. Let's see here. Period. So basically what this word... I'm kind of in front of the word. Hello. 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 It ends in an O, basically. I can't move out of the way. So this basically translates to the Southern and Northern Quartz period. So essentially there's two courts happening here. Two imperial courts. So this goes from 1336 to 1392. It occurred during the formative years of the Muromachi Bakufu. So during this period, there existed a northern imperial court established by Ashikaga Takauji in Kyoto, and a southern imperial court established by Emperor Godaiko in Yoshino. All right. So this is the age, of course, of the shogun and the samurai. This is an example of samurai armor. It is said to be once owned by by this guy that we will be talking about here, Ashikaga Takauji. So the Kamakura shogunate lost power, but feudalism did not. Godaiko and the Kyoto nobility sought a return to courtly rule, but the warriors who fought for him, notably his general Ashikaga Takauji, had no intention of withdrawing quietly back into the provinces. So Godaiko, he overturned the Kamakura shogunate, but then Takauji is like, okay, well, now you're going to name me as shogun, right? And Godaiko was like, no, I'm not. I don't want any shogun, right? Hello, Yao. How you doing? Welcome in. You got done with school. Now you're going to continue school here. Feel free to lurk, though. Thank you for coming in. We appreciate it. Yeah, now more learning with Professor Red Wolf. So Godaiko, so Takauji was like, well, you're not going to name me shogun. I am not going to be happy with that. So the general revolted. And basically Godaiko had to flee southwards to Yoshino. And there he set up a court in exile that existed until 1392. And then Takauji, he installs a puppet emperor from a rival imperial line, who returned the favor by declaring Takauji shogun in 1338. So, Takauji got what he wanted, essentially. He just had to work around Godaiko. But Godaiko is, existing down in Yoshino, and he is, really interested in, of course, sole imperial rule and getting rid of the other guy and that kind of stuff. So each court and its allies fought each other for 56 years until reunification was agreed upon in the peace treaty of Meitoku. So this was a rather tense time period for quite a long time. Alright, so that is an example of samurai armor, or parts of samurai armor, and this is a very high-end example, more of an arty kind of example. rather than something that would necessarily be used in battle, they did make display armor. Oftentimes it would be like donated to temples and shrines and things like that. So we've reached the Muromachi period, and that's an I behind my head. I need to remember to put the words in a better place. I need to move the words over. So here's another image of a battle. As I said, we're going to get a lot of these in Japanese history and art history. This is again a woodblock print. They're very common in Japanese art. So the Muromachi and the Nambokucho periods overlap. But the Muromachi runs to 1573. So why is it called Muromachi? So the new shogun Takauji, he sets up his headquarters in the Muromachi district of Kyoto. So he could keep a close eye on his puppet emperor, right? Because he had put that guy in charge. So he wants to make sure that guy's doing what he wants him to do. And he also knows that, like, Godaiko really wants Kyoto. So he's going to try to keep an eye on any shenanigans Godaiko might try to pull. Am I a history teacher, or is this all self-researched? I was an art history teacher, yes. I used to teach at university. I don't do it anymore, but I used to teach art history, visual culture, things like that. I have a PhD in art history. That's why I sound weirdly excited by this stuff. So there was a lot of, what do I do now? I stream on Twitch. That's pretty much what I do. So there was a lot of shenanigans, right? Godaiko is really Dr. Red Wolf. Yeah, it's Dr. Red Wolf, but like, I don't want to use Dr. Red Wolf because that people might think I have a medical degree, and, you know, please don't come in and ask me why your elbow hurts. I don't know. So Godaiko is really trying to get rid of Takauji, and then, but, you know, it doesn't exactly work. Essentially, with very few exceptions, the Ashikaga shogunate is relatively ineffective. Hi Tapper, how you doing? Welcome in. My camera's all over the place today. So Takauji and his heirs struggled to control the provincial warlords. The word for these provincial warlords is daimyo. And they relied on these people to maintain control over the countryside and collect taxes, right? So if you want to have a powerful government, you need to have a powerful military. And in order to have a powerful military, you need to collect taxes. Whether or not your people like it or not, whether or not the actual, like, townspeople and rural farmers and things like that actually want to give you taxes, well, that's how you run a military. Not gonna lie, you were way better than your Japanese history teacher you had while living in Japan. Were they Japanese or were they American? Yes, taxes. Exclamation point cry. That is basically a lot of the Japanese response to taxes as well. Lurk, Ramen Calling, thank you for the lurk. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming by. Any lurks are greatly appreciated. So there were also, so you had the daimyo who were like, well, I don't really like you guys, and we're not gonna, like, work well with you. So of course that's gonna go against the shogunate's power. And then you also had Buddhist populist revolts happening, and then we had vigilantism, which fed off of and further exaggerated the lack of strong central authority. Basically, you know, people who are bringing the law into their own hands and not necessarily following the shogun's laws. They were American, but you mean the guy lived in Japan forever? Oh. Yeah, only for a year? Oh. I thought maybe you lived there for longer than a year. At least a year is a lot, though. I mean, a year is still good. I didn't do any foreign exchange stuff when I was in school for half of my life. I kind of regret that, but, you know. I had animals most of my schooling years, so I didn't want to, like, leave my cat and my dog and all that kind of stuff, you know. So by the 1400s, the warlords, these daimyo, had succeeded in carving Japan into a patchwork of fiefdoms, and castles and fortresses were going up around the country. So essentially they're like, well, you know, this shogun doesn't really have a lot of power. I don't want to listen to them. So I'm just going to make my own little, like, empire to myself in these fiefdoms. And of course, as you build castles and fortresses, that means that you are equipped to fight your neighbors, right? More than the shogun really wants you to be. You would have stayed more, but you didn't want to work as a teacher's assistant in the middle of nowhere. Oh, okay. So they, like, assign you to go somewhere. Thank you for the alert, Dr. Leo. Thank you. Thank you very much. Class conflict schedule. Cry. Exclamation point, cry. So the Onin War erupts. And so this is a Battle of Onin that you see during the Onin War in this woodblock print. So it occurred between 1467 and 1477, and it all but destroyed Kyoto. Like, Kyoto has a habit of basically being burned down to the ground, unfortunately. I mean, it hasn't happened recently, but throughout, especially medieval history, Kyoto gets destroyed a lot, unfortunately. So two rival clans come into the picture who wielded much of the power in the capital, and they begin to fight over who has the throne. And this escalated into a nationwide civil war involving the Ashikaga shogunate and a number of other daimyo in other regions of Japan, right? So it became this competition of, like, who's on first, who's really in charge, right? So this war initiated the Sengoku Jidai, which is we refer to it as the Warring States period. That's a term that's borrowed from Chinese history. It sounds cool, and it was adopted into this Japanese period as well. So it's a long, drawn-out struggle for domination by individual daimyo, resulting in a mass power struggle between various houses to dominate the whole of Japan, and it lasted for a century until 1568. So this wasn't like a fun time, right? Hopefully that's pretty clear. So basically you have 100 years of people fighting each other, trying to be in charge of the country, trying to have control over the throne. Not super fun times. So this, at the same time period, we get Zen Buddhism coming over to Japan. And this is towards the end of the Kamakura period. It was introduced to Japan from China, where it was already highly developed, and it was called Chan in China. And Zen had been slow to reach Japan because of the interruption of relations between the two countries during the Heian period. But during the Kamakura era, both immigrant Chinese and Japanese monks who went to China to study Buddhism and then returned home enthused about the new teachings they had learned there. So you get Zen coming to Japan, and unlike Pure Land Buddhism, the monks those Pure Land Buddhist monks wandered the countryside, and they relied on the generosity of believers to support them. So they would, other people would have to feed them and give them money and that kind of stuff. So essentially, like, they would beg for alms. But the Zen monks secluded themselves in monasteries and led a really austere life of simplicity and self-responsibility. In some ways, Zen resembles the original teachings of the historical Buddha in that it emphasizes individual enlightenment through meditation. The Buddha attained enlightenment by basically meditating. That's all he did in order to attain enlightenment. So you're not using the help of other deities or magical chants or prayers or talismans or anything like that, right? It's just all within yourself. So this especially appealed to the self-disciplined spirit of the samurai warriors who were not satisfied with the older forms of Buddhism, particularly because they were connected with the court system, right? The imperial court, which is like stuffy and snobby, and they're like, well, that's not how we want to be. So Zen was the last major form of Buddhism to reach Japan from the Asian mainland, and it had a profound and lasting effect on Japanese history, arts, and culture. So one of the images from Zen Buddhism that we often see is this guy here, Dharma. And in Sanskrit, he's known as the Bodhidharma. He's the first patriarch of Zen Buddhism, who, according to legend, sat in a continuous meditation for 9 years in a cave in northern China. So this is like a clear example of someone who has removed himself from the world, and in order to, work his way towards enlightenment, he just meditates for 9 years in a cave. So today you see these Dharma sculptures around. That's what those little ball things are that you see in this picture. I think there's a Pokemon like this. You see this in a lot of anime and popular culture and visual culture. So you can buy one of these sculptures and you make a wish on it, essentially. And as you make the wish, you paint in the left eye, and then you get it blessed at a temple. So this is the display of the temple. And when the wish comes true, you paint the right eye in, and then you display it at the temple. So you can see in this picture, you have a lot of things with both eyes painted in, so hopefully the wish actually came true. And you also see one example of the wish hasn't come true, and they haven't painted in the other eye yet. So if you see it, one of these things with the paint, the one eye is there and one eye isn't there, it's like, it's not because he's blind or whatever. It's because the wish hasn't come true yet. All right. So he's a very common image in art for Zen Buddhism. And we'll talk more about Zen and how it relates to other parts of Japanese culture in the future. So for now, we will talk about the samurai or Jito just a little bit. It's obviously a huge topic, but just in case you don't know anything. At this point in history, this hereditary warrior class is really controlling the government, society, and culture. They're getting more and more of the money and power. So the prime duty of a Jito is like the older word for samurai, as I said before, I think. So this is a name for the warrior class until the 12th century, from about the 12th century onward to 1868. The idea was to give faithful service to his lord, so those daimyo. In fact, the origin of the word samurai is closely linked to a word meaning to serve. So they're very instantly, recognizable. This guy here, he doesn't have all of his armor on, but we saw an earlier image of the plated armor, which is tied together with silk cords. You have, the terrifying face guards and the helmets with the crests and the horns. They are one of the most enduring images of Japan. The samurai's best known weapon was the katana sword. You can see an image. He has two swords here. Usually you had a katana sword and a shorter sword. Why are you whining? I gave you treats. And you also see that he has a spear here as well. So the katana sword was used in one-on-one combat, but you're not supposed, oftentimes in European medieval imagery, you have these two people, clashing and banging their long swords together, and that's not how katana works. You don't want to hit your katana against another katana, because basically you're going to render the sword unusable. The method of katana sword fighting is to basically have faster footwork than your opponent, so you can slice open a body part while they're not, while they're still trying to reposition themselves. It's not a sword versus sword clashing kind of combat. Yeah, the dog wants more treats, Dad. You are correct. Let's give him more treats. Hold on. can't win. I can't win. Does he whine this much when I have my headphones on and I just can't hear him? Hi, Dad. How's it going? Welcome in. The metal was not the finest in Japan, so the swords themselves. Yes, it's a different kind of steel, and it basically chips and breaks quite a bit. Yeah, Harold was over here whining next to me. And also, the way that the katana is made, you have the round guard, you know, so you can't really like push your hand or your thumb against the sword in the same way you can with Western swords. So in order to like push your sword against another person's sword, that kind of thing. But yeah, the metal is just not the same quality. Funnily enough, steel folding was designed out of necessity due to that. Yeah, exactly. You had to. A lot of things. Hello, Shade. I don't know. Do I call you Shade or call you Lord or Shade Lord? Hey, Shade Lord. How you doing? Welcome in. So primarily, you have this like one-on-one combat up close would be done with katanas, but most of their battle was actually executed as archery on horseback. That was really their specialty, or with the long spear. So you can see him, he's holding a long spear, and there's different types of long spears at this time with different names. But those are the primary weapons, the archery and the long spears. The katana and the one-on-one combat is really like the last ditch thing in order to, you want to kill the person before you get to that level, because it requires a lot of skill. So today we know the samurai code of conduct as Bushido, i.e. the way of the warrior. How much the samurai actually practiced such a code during medieval times is debatable. Many historians regard it as a 19th century posthumous invention in some ways, i.e. like we made it up afterwards. The actual day-to-day existence of a samurai through time and space probably varied greatly, right? If you had a 12th century samurai versus a 15th century samurai, they might not see eye to eye on things. So yes, loyal service to their lord was highly valued. Disgrace and shame were to be avoided above all else, and all insults were to be avenged. Seppuku was an honorable death, preferable to surrender. So the samurai would ritually disembowel himself. That's usually why they would have a short sword, specifically for that purpose. Or sometimes they would just pretend to do it, and then a loyal officer would behead him. Basically, cutting your abdomen open is highly painful, and it is meant to be incredibly painful. So sometimes they would just pretend to do it, and then one of their attendants would cut their head off. So this here is a Moriran Maru. He was an attendant of Oda Nobunaga, and we'll talk about him more. But he's a very famous name, and he comes up in a lot of different popular culture. And he shows up in a lot of art as well. So let's see here. Moving on. So here we have an image by Felice Beato. It's a hand-colored photograph. So basically in the mid-1800s, he got permission, and we'll talk about why he got permission, but he got permission to come to Japan and take photographs. So he took a lot of interesting photographs of people in their day-to-day lives, as well as these posed interior shots as well, and people who were in like samurai outfits. Were they actually samurai? Maybe, maybe not. Women in courtesan outfits, women in like their day-to-day wear, that kind of stuff. So we have this interesting catalog of photographs that were created by him. So if you're interested in like what Japanese people like look like and were wearing during the mid-1800s, it's interesting to go look up his images. There's a lot of his images online, luckily for us. And hand-colored basically means it was a black and white image from the camera, and then you'd have people who would physically color in the image. So we're looking at, blues, greens, reds, that kind of stuff in the image. Is it actually accurate to what it looked like in reality? We don't know. But it made them more marketable, and he would often create photo albums and then sell them, of course. That's the main idea of what he was doing. He traveled all around the world and took a lot of images, both of these kind of like day-to-day life and studio photographs, as well as he took a lot of war photography as well. So very famous name. If you're interested in photography of ye old times, I would definitely look him up. So subterfuge among the samurai was despised, to be despised. So you had the ninja category, and those are the people who are in charge of subterfuge, right? Sneaking up behind people and assassinating them in the night, that was the ninja job. The samurai were not supposed to be doing that. And they were also supposed to shun all commercial and financial transactions, i.e. they're supposed to be above that. Like the daimyo isn't supposed to be, the daimyo, the lord, is supposed to be in charge of the money, right? The samurai are not supposed to pay too much attention to that. For obvious reasons. You know, you don't want the samurai to get too powerful or too wealthy on their own, right? You want them to be beholden to you. So towards the oppressed, the samurai was expected to show benevolence and exercise justice, but perhaps all these things, you know, are basically making them sound a little bit too much like superheroes rather than the humans that they were, right? Because these humans live through very difficult times and experiences, so to be like, well, they're gonna show benevolence and exercise justice at every turn, like, probably not. Let me have some tea here before I lose my voice. So not all, and probably very few samurai lived up to this code of conduct we associate with them now. Some were simply professional mercenaries, loyal to the highest bidder, i.e. who could pay them the most. They were often unreliable and defected, sometimes in the middle of battles. They indulged in double-crossing, disloyalty, and displayed cowardice as much as the next person. These behaviors were often very popular to show in Japanese theater, and so we see a lot of plays dedicated to samurai stories and themes. So here is another image from Felice Beato with multiple guys dressed as samurai. So those samurai who became lordless, and this is a word that you're probably familiar with, for one reason or another were called ronin, i.e. wanderers or, you know, masterless samurai. They acted more like bandits and were a serious social problem. So they could be mercenaries and, you know, loyal to the highest bidders, but sometimes they were like just loyal to themselves, you know. So that is going to lead to social issues and unsafety. But the samurai class persisted until 1868 during the Meiji Restoration, which we will get into, when they were replaced with a conscript army, in other words, a drafted army. However, the samurai didn't disappear. Many of them were involved in the Meiji government, and then later they became a cultural icon that was revered by the imperialistic military of the 20th century in Japan. And of course, today they are multivalent, meaning they have many meanings, many significances, and their role in both Japanese and world culture is very complex. So we'll talk more about their history and culture as we move forward and in future lectures, because obviously they're pretty important. Moving right along. So the samurai legacy finds modern echoes in the Japanese national characteristics of forbearance and stoicism, i.e. restraint or self-control and bearing with pain, hardship without complaint. You know, a lot of people who sort of analyze, you know, modern society in Japan, you know, they look at Bushido, they look at the samurai mindset, and they think it might be actually kind of negative, right? That whatever your boss tells you at work, you have to do and put up with it, which obviously isn't really good psychologically for yourself if your boss is like a giant pain in the butt, you know? So this is something that, you know, people are looking at psychologically in Japanese society, being like, well, you know, why do we act this way, and is it always really in the best interest of our people? So sometimes samurai themselves were artists and philosophers, you know, poets, playwrights, that kind of stuff. And one of the examples of these kinds of people is Miyamoto Musashi. He was a Japanese swordsman, philosopher, strategist, writer, and he was a ronin as well. So he's typically known as Musashi, and he became renowned throughout, you know, history basically, because of stories of his unique double-bladed swordsmanship, so dual blades, if Tifei is still listening. and his undefeated record in 61 duels. So he is considered to be a kensai, which is the word for sword saint of Japan. So that kind of tells you how much swordsmanship and samurai are revered in Japan, you know, this warrior class idea. So he was the founder of a specific style of swordsmanship, and so he had like a school of it, essentially. And he also authored books. The most famous of these are the Book of Five Rings and The Path of Aloneness. The dog is drinking water now. And they're both like talking about his philosophy of battle, essentially, that kind of stuff. So, and both of these documents are given to one of his students right before his death, so sort of passing on his knowledge. So it deals with the practical martial arts strategies that he had, and then the significance in his head, sort of his ideology, his ideas, his life philosophy behind the way that he fights and lives his life. So that's what those books are about. So there's currently an actual training center in his name, which exists in the Okayama prefecture in Japan, and we may travel there together as a class in the future and figure out what kind of things they offer. So obviously this vagabond manga is one of many popular culture stories about him. This is not historically accurate. It's a very interesting, you know, depiction of his life, but it's not historically accurate. So always take that kind of stuff with a grain of salt when you have stuff about Musashi. Like how much of it is actually true, how much of it is fantasy, you know. He's a very interesting character, so it's understandable that people want to use him in stories and things like that. And obviously, like, do we have a complete understanding of his history? No. There's a lot of different theories and stories that go around in connection with him. So our next time period is Zuchi Momoyama. So there's a Momoyama, there's an A behind my head here. Let's see, let's touch the other computer there. Okay. So depending on what book you're reading, of course, it basically goes from like 1573 to 1600 or 1568 to 1603, like depending on like what author you're reading and what their opinion is of when things start, when things end. History is sometimes quite arguable. So it's named after two castles. So the first is this one here. This is Nobunaga's Zuchi. So this is a reproduction of the castle. Neither of these castles actually exist, as my dog makes a ton of noise ripping up his treats, today. So this is a reproduction of it. All that remains of this original castle is the stone base. But luckily we have these reproductions. This is an era of grand castle building. So it's basically these lords are really showing off their power by building castles and basically being like, come at me, bro. So in the latter half of the 1500s, a series of powerful daimyo attempted to bring the country back under unified rule. The first of which was Oda Nobunaga. So that's basically 1534 to 1582. Then we go into Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1527 to 1598, and then our last major dude is Tokugawa Iyasu, 1542 to 1616. So by now Europeans had begun to arrive on the Japanese islands, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So they bring with them Christianity and new technologies, including firearms, which had dramatic consequences for Japanese history, as you can imagine. So one of the most successful warlords to take advantage of firearms was Oda Nobunaga. So starting from a relatively minor power base in what is now Aichi Prefecture, he managed to outmaneuver rivals, including several of his own family members, seizing Kyoto in 1568. So he installs a puppet shogun from the Ashikaga clan called Yoshiaka. So instead of assigning himself as shogun, initially he sort of like smooths the transition by using ye old Ashikaga clan and putting them into place as a shogun. So he's taking this step to protect himself and his interests. Eventually, he drives out Yoshiaka in 1573, but he never takes the title of shogun for himself. So it's kind of like, I'm in power, but it's kind of a secret, you know? But, like, everybody knows. So he held power. He was noted for his brutality and his disdain for Buddhist priests. He tolerated Christianity as a counterbalance to Buddhism's hegemony. And this is something that comes up in Japanese history quite a bit. Religion has a lot of political control in Japan. Later on, during the U.S. occupation, a lot of measures are taken to basically stop that from happening anymore. But during these time periods, religion has a lot of control over politics. So when I say the word hegemony, you know, I hate it when professors use words that, like, they just assume y'all know what they are. But hegemony basically means the preponderant influence or authority of others, the domination, the social, cultural, ideological, or economic influence exerted by a dominant group. In other words, the Buddhists had too much power. The priests had too much power. The temples had too much power. He recognized this. So anything that could undermine that, he was all for, including Christianity, including the Europeans. He was okay with that. So that's the first castle there. And our second castle, this is again a reconstruction. It was destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, that kind of stuff. And this is a replica that was constructed in 1964, which you can see today. So luckily, a lot of these castles have been rebuilt for us. You know, unfortunately, a lot of them have been destroyed, but there are a lot of reconstructions. So Nobunaga was actually forced to commit suicide. That seppuku thing that we were talking about. So one of his generals basically turns against him and forces him to commit suicide after an ambush. And then another one of his generals takes up the torch of unification, and that is Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And he started as a foot soldier, and he rises through the ranks to become Nobunaga's favorite. And then, you know, over basically 8 years, he takes control of the country once again. So Hideyoshi's power had been briefly contested by Tokugawa Iyasu, who was the son of a minor lord allied to Nobunaga. So it was like, who should be in charge? But eventually Iyasu agrees to a truce with Hideyoshi, and in return Hideyoshi grants him 8 provinces in eastern Japan, which are near present-day Tokyo, and they're like way away from where Yasu is from. So he's just like, okay, this is not going to help him at all, you know, this isn't where his family is from, he's not going to know anybody there. He intended this to weaken Iyasu by separating him from his ancestral homeland of Chubu, which is now Aichi prefecture. But Yasu was like, no, I'm going to use this to my advantage. He looks upon the gift as an opportunity to strengthen his power. So he's like, okay, I'm going to have my ancestral homeland. I'm going to have these eastern lands too. I'm going to build up my power. So Hideyoshi built a shoei castle, and you can see this is one of the examples. The Momoyama Castle, also known as Fushimi, as an example of this type of castle building enterprises that the families are carrying out at this time period. And it takes about 100,000 workers 3 years to build these things. He has one that's particularly famous in Osaka. And then the emperor crowns him regent. And what that regent means is, like, basically you're in charge, right? It's not a shogun, you're a regent. But it's similar idea. So in his later years, he became increasingly paranoid, cruel, and megalomaniacal, which is not really great to have as ruler. So he had grand plans for a pan-Asian conquest, and his first step in order to accomplish this, he attempted an invasion of Korea in 1592, which failed amid a lot of bloodshed. 3 years to build that, you could do that in like 2 days tops. Sure, Flora, welcome in. So the first invasion of Korea failed. He tries again in 1597, but the campaign is abandoned when Hideyoshi dies of illness in 1598. And these invasions severely damaged the relationship between the two regions. Like, oftentimes they would be allies, Korea and Japan, but you know, this guy starts trying to take over, and they're like, this isn't cool. Hi, welcome in. So on his deathbed, Hideyoshi entrusts Iyasu, who had proven to be one of his ablest generals, with safeguarding the country and the succession of his young son Hideyori. So basically he's like, Iyasu, you gotta protect my son and make sure that he can take over and has the power, right? And Yasu, however, of course, had no intention of being a subject of Hideyori, and he soon went to war against those loyal to Hideyori and finally defeated them in the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. And that's a very famous battle name. It'll probably come up again as we talk about things. And one of the things that occurred during that battle is a lot of double-crossing, essentially. Like, a lot of samurai groups, when they saw that Yasu was winning, they switched sides, and basically that led to him winning completely. So in 1603, the emperor names Tokugawa Iyasu as shogun. So he decides he's not going to go with regent. He's not going to go with he's not going to try to be crowned emperor or have his son crowned emperor or anything like that. He's going to go back to that idea of shogun. So breaking with centuries of tradition, he decides to locate his government not in Kyoto, but within his own stronghold in eastern Japan, right? Those lands that Hideyoshi had given him, he's like, okay, well, I already made this a very powerful base, so I'm going to make this my capital, essentially. And he chose a small castle town called Edo, which is present-day Tokyo, for his capital. All right. So for now, a little bit, we'll get into the Christian century, when Christianity actually could exist in Japan, because as it happens, it was eventually not allowed to exist in Japan. So, the Christian century. My dog is making a ton of noise today. I don't know why. I apologize in advance to anyone who has just walked in to this. My dog is being a pain. So this is a painting of Portuguese in Japan in the 17th century. We do have some images of Europeans and Africans and things like that. And that's one image of that. Who is Christian? Not sure you know him. Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. So Nobunaga was using Western firearms, right? Where did he get these things from? So the first Europeans in Japan were actually 3 Portuguese sailors from a vessel that ran aground on Tanegashima in Kyushu in 1543. And then we started having merchants come over, and they paved the way for Portuguese and Spanish Catholic missionaries, notably St. Francis Xavier, who landed in Kyushu in 1549. By 1600, these missionaries had converted 150,000 Japanese, which is not, like, insignificant, of course. So initially the government was okay with these Christian missionaries and converts, seeing them as a buffer between the state and the Buddhist sects, essentially muddying the water of political control. As I said before, you know, these 3 rulers were like, okay, maybe we should let Christianity happen because it's undermining the power of Buddhism and the Buddhist priests and the temples and that kind of stuff. But eventually, they were seen as a threat, and throughout the 1600s, persecution escalated. And during the Shimabara Rebellion, in the basically the late 1630s, in reaction to increased taxes, over 37,000 people, mainly Christians, were massacred. And that was kind of like an excuse. Did they actually rebel? Was there a rebellion? Probably not. It was probably just an excuse to kill a whole bunch of Christians. So the main Christian leader was beheaded, and Christianity was outlawed at that point. So basically, Catholics had, Japanese Catholics had to practice in secret. Statues of Mary were disguised as the Bodhisattva Kannon. Prayers were chanted in the intonation of Buddhist sutras to mask their content. And teachings were passed down orally, as possessing a Bible was a capital offense, i.e. you could be killed for having a Bible. in the 234 years before Christianity could be practiced openly again, the absence of priests at these secret lay meetings led to unorthodox beliefs, such as ancestor worship kind of like seeping into the faith, like old Japanese ideas seeping into these Catholic faith ideas. A lot of these Christians gave up these syncretic beliefs when foreign priests returned to Japan in the late 1800s, but tiny communities in Nagasaki's Goto Island still carry on the faith of the hidden Christians. So this is something interesting that happens because of the persecution, because of the unfortunate persecution. So we're moving into the Edo or Tokugawa period. So this is the beginning of 250 years of relative peace in Japan. It's a common saying in Japan, you know, it's something that's taught to school children, that Oda Nobunaga made the pie, Toyotomi Hideyoshi baked the pie, and Tokugawa Iyasu ate it. So the last man was able to actually enjoy the actual benefits of all of the hard work of the first two men that they had put in for unification. He actually gets the peacetime, right? So obviously history is a bit more complex than a simple pie metaphor, but it is an interesting way to think about this time period. Yes, yummy pie. So the Tokugawa shoguns would rule for 2.5 centuries, from 1603 to 1868. And Tokugawa Iyasu was both an ambitious ruler and an ambitious city planner. He built the world's largest fortress, Edo-jo, i.e. like Edo Castle. When you have that jo added onto things, it means castle, essentially. And around the castle, he built a spiral system of moats, and this is designed to basically, you know, lose the castle. The whole center of Tokyo is designed for you to get lost, specifically so that you can't get to his castle, right? So it's very easy to get lost in Tokyo. So he had this system of moats that were dug, and they were all dug by samurai that had been attached to the clans who had opposed Tokugawa, so lucky them. Jo Castle got it. Well, it's just J-O, but yeah. Not with the E, just J-O. But yes. So all these unfortunate people had to dig the moats for him, and they also made a canal system to bring water to the population, and the population in Edo quickly swelled to 500,000 by 1650, and it continues growing. Much of the city's stability, I'm going to look at a picture here. So this is a statue of Tokugawa Iyasu at the Tosho Shrine in Nikko, Japan, that you can see him looking at us, judging us probably. So much of Tokyo, you know, Edo's stability and swift rise in population and popularity can be attributed to a strategic move by the Tokugawa regime that ensured its dominance. It is a system called Senkin Kotai, and that demanded that all daimyo in Japan spend alternative years in Edo. So the idea is they come to Edo, they bring all their stuff, they establish their wives and children in Edo, and then every other year or so, they go back home, but they leave their family in Edo, and they take care of, you know, the business of their homeland, essentially, and then they come back. So essentially, you're making their family, their wives, their children, and usually daimyo would have multiple wives. Bringing more children into the world was important for them. They're hostages, right? Like the shogun is in charge of Edo, and your family's all there, but you have to go home for a couple years and do stuff, and then you hope that your family's okay. So this really instills a sense of like, well, I really don't want to do anything to tick off the shogun, right? So they would go home to administer their home provinces, and it made a very like dislocating policy in a lot of ways. It made it very hard for ambitious daimyo to, you know, undermine the power of the shogun. Like, you weren't home long enough in order to make strong alliances in your local area, and then you had this tremendous cost of traveling. You had to have a huge retinue of people and supplies to travel across Japan to get to Edo, and then you had to maintain 2 households, right? You had to maintain a household of, like, you know, sufficient wealth, and you had to show it off in 2 locations, and this really erodes their finances. You wanted to show off your wealth as much as possible as you traveled. You didn't want to seem to be poor, and you didn't want your households to seem to be poor. So essentially all of your wealth goes into this process of having 2 households and traveling. And this makes these daimyo unable to pay anybody to fight for them, right? So even if you don't like what the shogun is doing, you don't have any money. You don't have any extra money to actually pay anybody to fight it, right? Yeah, hostages is basically the best way to put it. Yeah, I mean, and it was all very purposeful, you know, very strategic. I mean, he didn't come up with the idea. This is an idea that has been used throughout the world in order to control people. So, you know, that's not a new idea, but the Tokugawa shogunate used it very, very rigidly and to great effect. So the Tokugawa-style micromanagement extended to directly controlled ports, mines, major towns, and other strategic areas. Movement of people was severely restricted by checkpoints. You needed to have written authority for all of your travel. You couldn't just like leave your house and, you know, walk 5 towns over. Like, that wasn't allowed. You needed to have actual permission to do so. And wheeled transport was outlawed. Like, you might have an ox cart with, like, you know, full of rice or whatever as you're moving it from one town to the other, and that might be allowed. But if you had a long, like, wagon train of wheeled vehicles, that is outlawed. It may be carrying arms, it may be moving soldiers across the country. Like, that is a potential danger, right? So early on, the Tokugawa shogunate adopted a policy of sakoku, which is closure to the outside world. So the regime was leery of Christianity's potential influence and expelled all of the missionaries in 1614. All Westerners except the Protestant Dutch were expelled by 1638. So the shogunate found Protestantism less threatening than Catholicism, knowing that the Vatican could muster one of the biggest military forces in the world. So the Pope had a very powerful military force at this time. And they would have let the British stay if the Dutch had not convinced the Japanese shogun that Britain was a Catholic country. It was not. Not anymore. King Henry VIII had declared Britain to be Church of England Anglican in 1534 after being excommunicated by the Catholic Church because he wanted a marriage annulment. But nevertheless, the Dutch were very tricky, and they convinced them. They're like, no, the British people are Catholic. They shouldn't be here either. So basically, the Dutch were really only a few dozen men, and they were confined to a tiny trading base on the artificial island of Dejima off of the coast near Nagasaki. Like, the Dutch did not have, like, free run of Japan. It was like, you can stay here and not go anywhere else. It was very restricted. So overseas travel for the Japanese was banned. You couldn't leave, and anybody who was already overseas could not come back. And yet the country didn't remain completely cut off, you know, so they still had trade with Asia and the West, continued through the Dutch and the Ryukyu Empire, which is now Okinawa. It was just tightly controlled, and, you know, along with the exchange of ideas, funneled exclusively through the shogunate, you know. There was not easy transport of goods and ideas, but it did happen. So this is a painting of a Portuguese vessel in the 17th century. It is a Japanese painting, and this refers to the Nanban trade. And Nanban means southern barbarian, and this is how they basically referred to anyone who, like, wasn't Japanese. So, like, the Dutch were Nanban, the Ryukyu Empire was Nanban, and that's just how it is. So if you see some things like referred to the Nanban trade, it may be several different types of, you know, nationality, ethnicities, but it's basically like these are the outsiders, essentially. So this Nanban trade was very controlled. Okay. Moving right along. Footloose and fancy. How many times am I going to sing that song? Okay, so here we have a frog. Hopefully y'all can tell that. Did my dog actually finally calm down? Probably not. So society under Tokugawa rule was rigidly hierarchical, comprising in descending order of importance the shi, i.e. the samurai, the no, who were farmers, the ko, who were artisans, and the sho, the merchants. So merchants were at the bottom of that, which is sort of like opposite of what our like capitalistic mindset is. Like, why would the merchants be at the bottom? But that's how it was. So your class dress, your living quarters, even your manner of speech were all strictly codified, i.e. controlled, and interclass movement was prohibited. So how you dressed, how you walked, how you talked, all of these things were controlled. It's a good frog, you approve? It is a pretty good frog, isn't it? So village and neighborhood heads were enlisted to enforce rules at the local level. In other words, like all eyes were watching you and making sure you behaved well. And this created an atmosphere of surveillance. Punishments could be harsh, cruel, and even deadly for minor offenses. And oftentimes whole families, clans, and towns would be punished for so-called crimes. So if you were going to commit a crime, like you were taking a chance that like everyone in your neighborhood could be punished for it. So that made sure that like everyone in your neighborhood really didn't want you to commit any crimes, right? So yet for all of its constraints, the Tokugawa period had a considerable dynamism. Japan's cities grew enormously during this period. Edo's population topped 1 million in the early 1700s, dwarfing much older London and Paris. Kyoto, which evolved into a production center for luxury goods, and Osaka, a center for trade, each hovered around 400,000 for much of this period. So although they sat at the bottom of the hierarchy, many merchants became fabulously wealthy, as you can sort of imagine, right? They're profiting from the great cost required of the daimyo for the processions and suitably grand lifestyles in Edo, right? Like, who are you going to pay for all of the goods to make your two households look good, and all of the goods in order to make your retinue look good, and you have to have nice clothes, and you have to look good. And all these things, and you have to give good gifts. That's another thing that's very important, is you have to give really impressive gifts, and then that, of course, requires money. So they're shut out from established status symbols by law. In other words, merchants can't dress too flashily. They can't have really expensive silks. You know, they can't have expensive hats. They can't have a whole procession of people walking around with them everywhere. That's not allowed. They couldn't wear embroidered silk, that kind of stuff. So they created their own culture, and one that revolved around the kabuki theater, sumo tournaments, and the pleasure quarters, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And the height of fashion was iki, which is a kind of rakish dandyism. So iki is specifically like a way of like, how am I supposed to explain it? But you're actually way fancier than you look. Like sometimes the exterior of their kimono would be like, you know, cheaper fabric that was allowed by law, and then the interior of their kimono would be super fancy, but you couldn't see it, right? So like this is like a hidden way to show off your wealth. And one of the hidden ways to show off your wealth was like these kind of netsukes. So the netsuke here of a frog is that little toggle. So the toggle would be attached above your kimono band there, your waistband. So it would be attached to a cord. So the frog has two little holes in the bottom of him. A cord would run through him, and then it would tie down to something like an inro. An inro is like a medicine container. So one of the things about kimono and traditional dress in Japan is that there's no pockets. So you would have these little containers. So you'd have, you know, pouches, purses, sacks, that kind of stuff. And then you would have these like, you have your decorative sash around your waist, and then you have this tiny decorative sculpture, you know, what the cord is made out of, what the container is made out of. So you'd have these subtle ways of showing your wealth, that they're not super flashy, they're not big, you know, it's not like you're wearing an entire kimono of embroidered silk or something. You'd have these types of things. So there's a lot of effort in this time period put into creating like very artisanal, fancy things like these tiny netsuke sculptures, and it's something that is collected a lot in American collections, in museums and things like that. So if you're ever in a Japanese art collection, you can look for these little netsuke, and usually they're not on their cords anymore. They're not attached to any containers or anything like that, so you really don't understand like what are these used for. Like, were they just displayed on a shelf or something? No, they were specifically worn on the body as a sign of wealth, prestige, class, what's the word I want? Oftentimes in the Nitsuke would refer to like sayings, poems, proverbs, that kind of stuff. So it's like showing your education in a very subtle way. Okay, so that is that. And moving on a little bit forward. So the heyday of Edo during this time period was the Prosperous Gingkoku period from 1688 to 1704. And this is during this time period, the Yoshiwara district, which is essentially the red light district, was a flourishing pleasure quarter of the city. This was called the floating world. So Yukio means floating world. And it's a world focused on alcohol, sex, temporary pleasures, art, that kind of stuff. So the whole idea of a floating world, it means transient, fleeting. Something quickly floats by. You can't really grab onto it. It's not permanent. That's the sort of concept that they're going for here. So this was the home of the geisha, the courtesans, and it formed the hub of an entire popular culture. There's a lot of fashion, literature, theater, graphics, arts, all related to this world. Yeah, art isn't temporary. I guess sometimes it is. Oftentimes art is temporary. I mean, not... The words you're seeing here aren't temporary. So these are ukiyo-e prints. So these are floating world art, essentially, is what we're looking at. The art of the floating world. I mean, these are easily destroyed, right? These are made out of paper. They're easily destroyed. And of course, when you have things like fashion, that often goes away very quickly. It's trends. They go away. Literature can also be destroyed. Theater is inherently, like, in the moment. There was no like recording a movie or anything at this time, of course. Once it happens, the words are spoken, they're already gone. The theater arts particularly exploded during this time period. Kabuki and bunraku. And bunraku is a type of puppet theater. And so we see a lot of ukiyo-e woodblock print masters coming into popularity at this time, including Utamaro, Sharaku, Hokusai, Hiroshige as examples. So these are Sharaku and Utamaro prints, and you often would have images of actors, famous actors during the theater of this time period, and then created, like, taking their famous roles and then putting them into art. So you see the role, essentially, but everyone knows that, like, this is the famous actor who plays this role. So that's essentially what these are. They're like, the People magazine of the day or something like that, where you want to look at the celebrities. And these are, an interesting way to communicate, fashion trends and that kind of stuff, hairstyle trends, etc. Often communicated through these ukiyo-e prints. And there's a lot of different styles of ukiyo-e prints, but the general idea is like they're trying to capture something about life which is not permanent. Okay, moving on. So what happens next? The black ships show up. Dun dun dun. So here we have our Hetalia scene, which I had to ask Tiger Gist to help me because I asked everybody, like, where is this from? And Tiger Gist was like, Hetalia. And I was like, okay, there we go. Because I took it from Hetalia, and then I didn't remember that I took it from Hetalia, so there you go. That's what happens. That's what happens. When you don't write the captions, which I still don't remember to write all the captions, you forget where you got things from. They can be destroyed, but books and paintings are designed to be permanent. They're the opposite of temporary. But I guess that wasn't the kind of art they were about in that place. I mean, today we design books and paintings to be permanent, but oftentimes in the past they just weren't. They were easily destroyed. I mean, there's a lot of fires. Things get destroyed, by water, mold, destruction, If you have something carved out of stone, you have a greater chance it's going to survive, but even like acid rain today destroys things. But yeah, I mean, even with, so the idea behind the ukiyo-e prints too, it was very quickly made prints. They look very cool today, but the idea was like mass production of these things in order to make money from it. So they were kind of like postcards or that kind of stuff. We see them as like super high fine art today, but really they were like posters and postcards for the time period that was creating them. So it really, like, the permanence of art really depends upon whether the society and culture that you're in actually values the thing, right? If we don't value the book, even if it is valuable, if the society doesn't value the book, we often destroy the things. If we don't value the painting or the work of art, we often destroy it. We just let it decay, go away. So it's always, often in the moment, you know, of like, are we actually going to value the things? So, the black ships, so by the 19th century, i.e. the 1800s, the Tokugawa Shogunate was losing its powerful grip on the country, right? That's how all things go in history. You have control for a little while, and then stuff happens. So it's questionable how much longer the shogunate might have held on, but as it happened, external forces came into play, which hastened its demise. So a number of Western vessels, which the Japanese called kurufune, which is black ships, because they were coated in black pitch, began appearing in Japanese waters since the start of the 1800s. Hello, Banana. Walks through the door, finds a seat in the class, and puts it on up. We taped. Welcome in, Banana. So these ships start showing up. So these ships want to open up Japan to more trade. They don't want to just have 24 Dutch guys on this tiny island off of Nagasaki. They're like, we want all of your ports to be open, not just one. We don't want it to just be the Dutch. We want it to be open to everybody. And you ship it, good one. And they wanted these ports to act as stopover locations to other ports in Asia, particularly like Shanghai and other ports in China and Korea. So if you have more ports open, you can stop over, you can resupply your ship and continue on your way, So they want open trade routes. So America was especially keen to expand its interests across the Pacific. Good old America. So yeah, I didn't even put a caption here for this guy. Dun, dun, dun. So in 1853, and again the following year, 1854, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry steamed into Etowah, which is now called Tokyo Bay, with a show of gunships and demanded Japan open up to trade and provisioning. So it was basically like, do it or else. So this is Commodore Perry here. This is an example of the type of ship that he's bringing. And the shogunate was no match for Perry's firepower and had to agree to his demands because, yep, his name is Commodore Matthew Perry. Yep. Unless I missed it up. Now I gotta look it up. I'm like, wait, did I do that wrong? No? Did I just type it in wrong? My old person? No, it's Matthew Perry. There we go. Matthew Calbreth Perry. There you go. I did get it right. Senility hasn't won yet. So Japan had nothing like this, right? They didn't have a ship like this. They didn't have any guns like this or anything because they had basically shut themselves off from the rest of the world for 250 years. And now they're being, modernity is being like shoved in their face and they're like, oh my. So they had to agree to his demands or basically, risk an all-out war, which they were not equipped to win. So soon an American consul arrived, and then other Western powers followed suit. So people are setting up, embassies and stuff in Japan, which was not allowed during the Tokugawa Shogunate. He did play Chandler and Friends. Not this Matthew Perry, but a different Matthew Perry. He was not still alive. This one was not still alive when they filmed Friends. Pretty sure he's dead. So you had these embassies being established, which, Japan was like, I guess, and Japan became obliged to sign what came to be called the Unequal Treaties, much to Japan's disapproval. I'm sure it's not the same. I mean, look at the pictures. You can probably compare on Google, the images of like one versus the other. It would be funny if they were like somehow distantly related. I don't know. So these unequal treaties like forced the opening of the ports, and they gave Western nations control over tariffs, and they also controlled the behavior of their countrymen while in Japan. So if you were a Westerner, or if you weren't a Japanese person, these treaties outline that if you committed some sort of crime or some sort of issue happened in Japan while you were there, you were not allowed to be tried in their courts there. So in other words, like, you could do whatever you wanted and you probably wouldn't get in trouble. So needless to say, Japan like didn't really like that, you know, and this is going to become a bone of contention throughout the time period, and you know, really up to today as well. These unequal treaties are something that you know, not great thing that happened. So despite last-ditch efforts by the Tokugawa regime to reassert their power, anti-shogun sentiment was high. So what happens is the shogun is like, oh, the regime recognizes they do not have the firepower to fight modern Western nations, right? So they sort of keep having to agree to what these Western nations want, but then these other anti-shogun groups of people, you know, come out of the woodwork. They probably didn't like the shogun in the first place, but they come out of the woodwork being like, why are you letting the Westerners do whatever they want to do? And of course the shogun recognizes like he doesn't have power to actually fight against these people. But these other anti-shogun people are like, we totally have the power, we can kick these people out. And if you really look at it, right, if you take a step back and look at it, it is an ideal situation of divide and conquer. So particularly in the outer domains of Satsuma, which is in southern Kyushu, and Choshu in western Honshu, you had these groups of people who were not pro-shogun at all, and they started a rebellion, and a movement arose called Revere the Emperor and Expel the Barbarians, and this was called Sonujoi. In other words, they wanted to restore the emperor to complete governmental control, end the shogunate, and kick all of the Westerners out. So this is ideal for the Western powers, right? You have one half of the country versus the other half of the country, and they're going to fight each other, and at the end of the day, you'll just have to deal with one of these groups, but they'll be weaker by the time they, you know, by the time they're done duking it out, you'll have fully established your trade and that kind of stuff, and there'll be no going back. So very subtle way to do divide and conquer, which, you know, arguably worked out not great for the Japanese. It also worked out perhaps great, you know. History is an odd thing, both good and bad. So there were some skirmishes with Western powers. So some of these, you know, rebellion people, these reformers who wanted the emperor back in power, they actually sought to fight the foreigners. They just did not have the weapons. They did not have the firepower. They did not have the strategic organization to fight these people. So they failed. So they decided that, like, okay, we can't expel the foreigners. That's not going to happen. But we can restore the emperor. So following a series of military clashes between the shogun's armies and the rebels proved victorious. So the last shogun, Yoshinobu, agreed to retire in 1867. So luckily he was able to just like live out his remaining years peacefully in Shizuoka. And he wasn't like, nobody required him to commit seppuku and get his head chopped off, luckily. But, you know, the Tokugawa loyalists did not go quietly into the night. The fighting continued, and especially in the northeast, from 1868 to 1869, and it is known as the Boshin War. So the disorienting collapse of the regimented world of the Tokugawa produced a form of mass hysteria / celebration. You know, things are changing very fast. And this was called Eija Naika. I'm not going to say that right, so I'm going to say it very slow. Eija Naika. And that basically translates to who cares? Like, who cares if I take off my clothes in the middle of town, you know? Who cares if I give my money away? Who cares if I light my house on fire, you know? It saw huge groups of people dancing, carousing, taking off their clothes, giving away possessions, having orgies, and it basically eventually descended into mob violence, and then it had to be like sort of stamped out, and eventually it ended. And it's a phenomenon that's being more carefully studied by historians recently, and it's not something that was like, again, advertised really isn't the right word, but it wasn't something that was like advertised that much in the past, that we all went a little bit crazy at the end of the Tokugawa era. But it did happen, and this is a scene of such a celebration, the collapse of the world as we know it kind of thing. Like, is this for good? Is this for bad? Is this the apocalypse happening? We're not really sure, right? And this is by a famous artist known as Kawanabe Kyosai. And we'll talk a little bit about him next here. Click all the things. Okay. So Kyosai Kawanabe, he basically lived from 1831 to 1889. And during the political ferment, which produced and followed the revolution of 1867, what we're talking about now, like, politics are changing a lot. Who's in charge? Who's fighting who? It's changing a lot. So he attained a reputation as a caricaturist, and that's sort of what you see here, like very exaggerated comic drawings. And he has a very famous long painting on a makimono, which is like a type of scroll, and it's called the Battle of the Farts. I couldn't find an image of the Battle of the Farts that like didn't include like things that can't be shown on Twitch. But this is the fart of the terrible farter, and it doesn't show like as many body parts as the Battle of the Farts. But you can see this is a very comic, over the top, this guy is, passing gas, and everyone is having some sort of over the top reaction. There's someone who has passed out, everyone's running away, or they're being knocked back. So this is the kind of like comic art that he produced. And it's often seen as a caricature of this ferment, where like things are happening, they're out of control, and nobody's really sure what to do. So he was arrested 3 times during this time period and imprisoned by the authorities of the shogunate. And he created, so obviously, his art is viewed as political. Today, when we look at this stuff, we don't realize that he's making like political commentary, but he was. And he created what is considered to be the first manga magazine ever in 1874, and it's called Ishibun Nipponchi, and he made it with Roban Kanagaki. So the magazine was heavily influenced by Japan Punch, which was founded in 1862 by Charles Workman, a British cartoonist, and Ishibun Nipponchi had a very simple style of drawing, so that they could produce multiple, they could produce a lot of them, but it didn't become very popular, and it ended after 3 issues, but it is the first manga to ever exist. So if you're interested in that, maybe we can talk about that more in the future. So very, very famous, interesting dude. So something else that's going on during this, time period where things are basically falling apart slowly, collapsing like a fly in the cupboard, is the Shinsengumi. So this is something that comes up in a lot of anime. Like in Gintama, the Shinsengumi exist, and sort of it as comic effect, but everything in Gintama is for comic effect. But there were a special police force organized by the Bakufu, that military government that we talked about, during the late Tokugawa shogunate, so when things are really tense. And they were active until 1869. It was founded to protect the shogunate representatives in Kyoto at a time when you have this, controversial imperial edict happen. So the emperor, the throne, the court is saying, like, we need to exclude foreign trade from Japan, and the shogun is saying, like, no, we can't do that because these Westerners are way more powerful than we are. We can't exclude them from the country. So this is what's happening. You have this push and pull against the imperial court and the shogun. And in order to protect the shogunate, you had this Shinsengumi police force that was essentially created. And these men are drawn from the sword schools of Edo and then sent to Kyoto in order to make sure that, like, basically nothing falls apart too quickly, so that the Westerners, like, don't get an excuse to basically take over Japan completely, right? So it had various names throughout history, but the most famous one that most people use is the Shinsengumi, particularly in popular culture. So their mission transformed from protecting the shogunate, representatives, to patrolling the streets of Kyoto and restoring order in the name of the Tokugawa shogun government. So a lot of things were happening. Chaos was descending, so they're trying to make sure that people are safe. So the code of the Shinsengumi was famously created by Shigekata Toshizo. It included 5 articles, so 5 points. Number 1, it prohibited deviation from the samurai code, i.e. Bushido, which of course, as we talked about before, is arguable about what exactly is Bushido. Number 2, you can't leave the Shinsengumi. Number 3, you can't raise money privately. Number 4, you can't take part in others' litigations. Number 5, you cannot engage in private fights. And there was a specific uniform for the Shinsengumi, so you would recognize these people. So the penalty for breaking any rule was seppuku. And in addition, if the leader of a unit was mortally wounded in a fight, all of the members of the unit must fight to the death on the spot, even in a fight where the death toll is high, you're definitely going to die, you have to fight to the death. And the unit was not allowed to retrieve the bodies of the dead, only the corpse of the leader of the unit. But essentially, this entire police force was destroyed during that Boshin War that we were talking about. So this image here, Hakuoki, comes from a Otame video game series. So it's called Shinsengumi Kitan. Hakuoki is Demon of the Fleeting Blossom. Shinsengumi Kitan is the tale of the Shinsengumi. So these are all members of the Shinsengumi in the Ultimate video game, or related to the Shinsengumi in some way. You have people against the Shinsengumi, you have people in the Shinsengumi, and then you have the main female character who interacts with all these male characters in the storyline. So this there's several games in this series, and then it was also adapted into an anime series as well. So it is a combination of fantasy as well as the historical elements, but it's one example that is they use actual historical names. Each of these characters has a historical name of someone who was actually in the Shinsengumi. So it's there's an interesting element of historical accuracy while also having demons in it. So it's interesting to look into. I was thinking about playing it for you guys, at least one of them, but it's very bloody. It's a very bloody ultimate, so I don't think I could actually handle seeing it. But if you're interested in learning more about it, it is an interesting anime to watch, and the films are interesting as well. So this brings us to the Meiji Restoration. So it's kind of a weird thing, right? The Meiji Restoration, what does that mean? What are we restoring, right? And essentially it's you're restoring the imperial court to power. That is what is happening. The shogun is ending, and the emperor is now in theory, complete control, which is of course not actually reality. So here you see Emperor Meiji. He's Prince Mutsuhito. So when you are a prince, you have crown prince. You have one name. Mutsuhito is his signature name. But when they come into power, they are given an imperial name. And this one is Meiji. He would never be called Emperor Meiji to his face or anything like that. He would just be called the Emperor. And then when he dies, then that name is assigned to the time period when he was reigning, right? So no one is. Are you okay over there? Dog's making weird noise again. So no one is calling him Prince, Emperor Meiji to his face, and obviously it would be very rude to call him Mutsuhito to his face too. So in 1868, the new teenage emperor Mutsuhito, later known as Meiji, was named the supreme leader of the land, and that's who you see here. And he is here in both traditional Japanese dress in one image of what the emperor would wear, and then you have the Western European influence style dress in this other portrait, which is really showing how the world is changing quite a bit. During the Meiji Restoration, a lot of things change very quickly. So this is the Meiji period, and Meiji translates to enlightened rule, and it runs from 1868 to 1912. So the institution of the shogun was abolished, and the shogunal base at Edo was refashioned into the imperial palace and the capital city, and it's given a new name, Tokyo, which means eastern capital. So basically, you know, the imperial court is like, well, we're gonna take everything that the Tokugawa shogun made in Edo, and we're gonna make it into our own thing. You know, thanks for building this for us. We'll take it now. However, in truth, the emperor, I mean, he took power when he was 14. You can imagine that, you know, a 14-year-old is not gonna like be able to like wield great power. And of course, as we've been talking about Japanese history, the emperor usually really doesn't have as much power as we think. There's usually someone in the imperial family behind the emperor pulling the strings. And it's important to keep that in mind. And in this particular case, the new government that they made after the shogun was basically dissolved really had the power. They had the actual power. And it was primarily formed of Satsuma and Choshu samurai. So it was really just different clans of samurai had taken control away from the shogun, and they slapped the label of like imperial power on it, but it was really other samurai clans. So the Meiji Restoration heralded far-reaching social changes. The four-tier class system, which we had discussed, was ended. After centuries of having everything prescribed for them, like what you could eat, where you could live, how you could dress, how you could talk, they're all free to choose their own occupation. You could choose where you wanted to live. You could move. You know, you could marry who you wanted to in theory, not in reality, but, you know. So a lot of people moved to the cities to join the growing workforce in the new manufacturing and white-collar sectors. And in 1898, Tokyo's population was just under 1.5 million, and by 1909, it had surpassed 2 million. So the cities are really growing. People are leaving the farmlands and going to the cities for these new jobs. And what are these new jobs, right? So clearly they're interested in westernization. They're interested in modernization. They're interested in industrialization, capitalism, all of these things. They're like, well, we have to catch up. We have to play a big game of catch up. So the new government sought to expand its rule. It annexed Hokkaido in the north in 1869, and the Ryukyu Kingdom, then a tributary of China, now present-day Okinawa, in 1869, imposing strict assimilation policies. In other words, you need to act Japanese. These were strategic choices to make sure Japan had more control over the region, and these areas didn't fall into the hands of Westerners, right? Because Westerners are, you know, the new leaders of Japan are keenly aware of what is happening in Asia, and a lot of Asia is being colonized by Westerners, right? And they don't want that to happen to them. So this new Japan moves quickly to modernize, as, you know, modernization in the terms of Western powers, to prove that they could stand on equal footing with the colonizers. Japan doesn't want to become another colony of the United States or England or whatever country, right? They don't want to become a territory of someone else. So they put in a lot of effort in order to prevent that from happening. Okay, moving on. How does that actually look, right? How does that actually look? So the government embarked on a grand project of fast industrialization and militarization. A great exchange began between Japan and the West. And, you know, this is the complete opposite of what's happening during the Tokugawa Shogunate, right? Like, nobody leaves Japan. Nobody comes into Japan. But now we are shipping out Japanese scholars and students all over. They're going to Europe. They're going to America. They are, you know, tasked with studying everything from literature, other languages, engineering, nation building, philosophy, modern warfare. Like, you study everything you can and bring it home, right? And then Western scholars were invited to teach in Japan's, you know, new universities. So new universities and colleges were established, and then they were inviting Western teachers over to teach in them. So again, this is two different ways to expand the knowledge of things that Japan has not caught up on yet. So the new Japanese establishment learned quickly. In 1872, the first railroad opened up, connecting Tokyo with the new port of Yokohama, which is like south along Tokyo Bay. You know, nowadays we just think of them as like right next door to each other, but of course, like having a railroad between the two was a big deal in the 1870s. And then by 1889, the country had a constitution, and this was modeled after the government frameworks of England and Prussia. Banking systems, a new legal code, and political parties were established. And daimyo, those warlords, those land-owning warlords, were persuaded, you know, using quotes, to give up their domain land to the government in return for governorships or other compensations, enabling a prefectural system to be set up. So they're undermining that feudal system by saying, like, well, we're going to take your land, and we're going to establish prefectures, and basically the government is in charge of them, and it's not individually owned anymore. However, cronyism persisted. So what is cronyism? It is the appointment of friends and associates to positions of authority without proper regard to their qualifications, right? People you know, family members, friends, that kind of stuff. You give them jobs even though they might not know how to do it at all. So the government took responsibility for establishing major industries and then would sell them off at bargain rates to chosen government-friendly industrial entrepreneurs, so people who they liked. Whether or not they really could do the job well or not is debatable. So they would make a whole shipbuilding industry, a whole railroad building industry, and then they would sell it off to a company who would then be in charge of it. And then you just sort of have to trust that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And this is a factor in the formation of huge industrial conglomerates known as zaibatsu, and many of them that were established here in the late 1800s still exist today, including Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui. These are all things that were established back then among, you know, a dozen others. So you have these huge companies that basically have their fingers in multiple pots of soup simultaneously. They're not just in charge of shipping. They're in charge of like many different types of businesses. That's how we get these conglomerates. So this is an example of how dress is changing in Japan at this time. So this is the typical male school uniform. So obviously school becomes very important. Children are prescribed to actually attend. That wasn't always true in the past. And this is a 1907 gakuran with cap. So this is the male school uniform, and it is specifically modeled after the Prussian uniform, which is, you can see an example here of the World War II model, which was called a Waffenrock. So that coat is basically a military uniform. And then, you know, Japanese school kids, they still wear these things today. And it comes from this westernization, this interest in militarization, you know, strength. You're looking at how does the West operate? How do they look strong? You know, we're going to do the same thing. And for girls, you know, again, we're being sent to school, but we're not wearing our kimonos. These are called fuku, and they are the sailor outfits that, you know, are stuck in our head as like, oh, Japanese sailor outfits for female students. This is circa 1928, and these were very easy to sew. So this is based on the Navy uniform, and a lot of, you know, international navies, they have this kind of uniform, and it's based on the easy to sew kind of style. But again, it's military. All of these uniforms are based on military uniforms. Did someone say sailor? Again, we got Yao's attention. We got Yao's attention, yes. This is ye old 1920s sailor outfit, not the kind of sailor outfit that Yao probably wants to see. Unfortunately. So by the 1920s, Western fashions and ideas, initially the domain of the elite, began to trickle down to the middle class. So that, you know, you get your shorter hairstyles, people wearing pants, you know, women wearing pants, that kind of stuff, even men wearing pants, you know, all of these Western fashion. Like the emperor, you saw him in his traditional dress, and then he had a different portrait, which was in Western dress, you know, and he was in something that was like very fancy military uniform, right? So women began to work more outside of the home, in offices, department stores, factories. They enjoy a new freedom and disposable income that they really did not have before. And like women around the world in the 1920s, they began to cut their hair short, wearing pants, that kind of stuff. And they became symbols for both the optimism and the dread that the new modern era inspired, you know. So like we're free to do this stuff, but like, what does this actually mean for our future? So unfortunately, Japan's pursuit of military might easily transformed into an aim to become a world power and an embrace of imperialism, right? So you have this campaign to make sure that the colonizers don't come in and colonize you, but then you become a colonizer. And that's unfortunately what happened, as I get stuck in a weird position there of my avatar. So following Prussian army and British navy models, Japan built up a formidable armed force. Using the same gunboat diplomacy on Korea that Perry had used on the Japanese. So in 1867, Japan was able to force on Korea an unequal treaty of its own and increasingly meddled in Korean politics. With Chinese interference, we're going to use that in quotes as an excuse / justification, in 1894, Japan manufactured a war with China and emerged victorious, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. As a result, it gained Taiwan and the Liaotung Peninsula. Russia pressured Japan into renouncing the peninsula and then promptly occupied it, which Japan was like, hey, wait a minute, that you said to give it back to the Chinese and you just took it. Hold on a minute. So that triggered the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which Japan won, which shocked the West completely, which even shocked Japan a little bit, but shocked the West completely. So like Japan is showing that like it has the ability to fight for itself. So then Japan officially annexes Korea in 1910. There was very little international protest. Like a lot of people were like, I don't know what to do about this, right? And by the time of Emperor Meiji's death, Mutsuhito's death in 1912, Japan was recognized as a world power, right? Like nobody's really sure what to do about what their actions are, you know. Their actions are happening, but nobody's quite sure what to do yet. So Japan entered World War I on the side of the Allies and was rewarded with a consulcy in the newly formed League of Nations. It also acquired Germany's possessions in East Asia and the Pacific. So they specifically chose the side that they could get the losers' belongings, essentially. And the war had been a boon for industry, creating a new stratum of wealth in Japan. However, the vast majority of the population was left out. So this image that you see here is this hearing and soul appeal cord. And what you see here is like Japanese men who are basically the guys behind the counter, and they're in charge of the court, and then you have Korean criminals, and this is the court system during this annexation period. So essentially, Japan colonizes Korea, and Korea can't manage to get itself out from underneath that thumb. And things are westernized a lot in Korea during this time period by the Japanese government, including the court system that you see here. And this quote here, "It is a tragedy of modern Korean legal history that every step of the reforms and modernization was accompanied by a progressive loss of national independence," right? So Japan is bringing all of these interesting Western ideas, technologies, architecture, and that kind of stuff to Korea, but Korean independence is being eroded at the same time. So this is a picture from what was called like it was a Korean photo album, which was commissioned by the resident general. So the main Japanese guy who was in charge of Korea was called the resident general, and he actually would commission these photo albums. And they're an interesting historical record of Korea at this point in time. You know, before, much longer than what it looks like now. So this was published in 1910. You know, none of the huge skyscrapers and stuff like that we see in Seoul today. So it's a lot of these books, these photo albums are online in case you want to look them up. You can see them. Many of them have been digitized by the National Libraries of Japan. So this is obviously going to make for a very unhappy relationship between Japan and Korea for many years, and even more horrible stuff happens, but we won't get into a lot of those details at this point. So we're moving into the Taisho and Showa eras. As I drink more tea, In case I lose my voice here. We're making good progress, though. Making good progress. So the early decades of the 20th century were a time of optimism when democratic ideals seemed to be overtaking feudal era loyalties. But there was a dark undercurrent of dissatisfaction both among certain political and military factions who felt that they were still not held in equal esteem by Western powers, and they were not, because Western powers are incredibly racist, and also by the poor. So the poor are also dissatisfied with the system that's being put into place, both rural and urban alike. As the Great Depression hits Japan, they're very dissatisfied with and appalled by the elite Japanese who seem completely under the sway of Western decadence. When you see people who are much more wealthier than you, and you're all talking and walking and acting and dressing like Westerners, like, you're not going to have a great opinion of the West, as you, like, suddenly lack the ability to eat. And these people are doing fine. So, let's see here. Moving on. So, you have a lot of dissatisfied people happening. Dissatisfied sections of the population growing, essentially. So the Washington Conference of 1921 to 22, which you see an image of it here, was called a Naval Disarmament Conference. In other words, like, after World War I, the idea is that we're going to have smaller navies, and that'll be less threatening to each other, and hopefully we won't start more wars, that kind of stuff. It's all, like, a great idea, but, like, that stuff never actually works. So this is an image of that conference, which of course is like full of like old, white, mustachioed men, right? And then the women are up there in the balconies, not allowed to do anything. So you can imagine like how much sway the Japanese had during this kind of thing. So during this conference, naval ratios were set, particularly of the most important part is 3 capital ships. So a capital ship is a large warship or an aircraft carrier. So these are the biggest, most important ships in your navy. So for Japan, they were allowed to have 3 ships for every 5 American ships and 5 British capital ships. So the Americans could have 5 capital ships, the British could have 5 capital ships, and then the Japanese could have 3. And if you think that sounds uneven in the math, you are correct. And it upset the Japanese quite a bit. However, they were well ahead of the French ratio, which was 1.75. The French could have 1.75 capital ships for every 5 American ships and British ships. I don't know how you have like a 0.75 of a capital ship, but I'm sure it made sense to someone. So around the same time that this happens, which, Japanese are not happy that they get 3 to 5, a racial equality clause was proposed by Japan to the League of Nations, and this was rejected, So, like, obviously, like, they're trying to even the playing field with these other powers, and, like, these other powers are not interested in that, right? So in 1924, America introduced race-based immigration policies that effectively targeted the Japanese. In other words, we don't want your kind here. That's basically what those policies said, unfortunately. And this is something that happens throughout American history, and of course is still happening today, of like some, racial group gets pinpointed and be like, we don't want your kind here, so this isn't new. But in the 1920s, it was particularly for the Japanese. So the Japanese armed forces bristled at the humiliation of yet another round of capitulation. So, like, Japan sees them as like, we have to keep agreeing to these things, and I don't want to, right? So Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi, he favored economic austerity, over military spending. So he didn't want a big military. He didn't want to feed that imperialistic machine. And a lot of people didn't agree with him. So he was shot in 1931. He died a couple months later. But by then, essentially, the military is acting on its own. And he was one of many politicians assassinated during this time period. It's a common feature of Japanese history and really world history in general to have these types of political assassinations. And at this time, he is not the only prime minister that was shot, because his beliefs didn't align with the military factions, this happened multiple times. And in the future, it happens multiple times that someone doesn't agree with your ideas and you get killed. So in the fall of 1931, members of the Japanese army stationed in Manchuria, which is North China area, who were there to guard rail lines leased by China to Japan. So basically, they made rail lines. China was like, you can lease these. But they detonated explosives along the track and blamed the act on Chinese dissidents. So they essentially they pretended to be attacked. And this ruse, which gave the Japanese army an excuse for armed retaliation, became known as the Manchurian Incident. So they made their own war. The Japanese easily overpowered the Chinese forces and within months had taken control of Manchuria and installed a puppet government. So this is going to trigger, I mean, there's a lot of things that trigger a lot of issues, but this is going to trigger a long line of stuff which is going to take a while to clean up, as you can imagine. So they've established this puppet government, but the League of Nations refuses to acknowledge the new Manchurian government. They recognize that Japan basically like made the situation up. Did Karen not get to speak to the manager? That would trigger a lot of things. Yep. It's like a much more escalated version of Karen not being able to speak to the manager. Welcome in, Legion. How you doing today? So the Japanese, you can see in this map here, they seized Manchuria in 1931, occupied much of the coast and North China Plain by 1941. They want to take all of China. China doesn't want them to. So Japan, upset that the League of Nations isn't playing the game that they want them to play, leaves the League in 1933. And then skirmishes continue along, between the Chinese and the Japanese armies, leading to a full-blown war in 1937. Thank you for following. Welcome in. So following a hard-fought victory in Shanghai, hello, welcome. We're talking about Japanese history today. So you have a hard-fought victory in Shanghai, so Japan wins that, takes Shanghai, and then they advance south to Nanjing. Nanjing is putting up a big fight. So this takes several months in order to take Nanjing, and they kill between 40,000 to 300,000 Chinese. So this is not Chinese army. These are civilians. So this is typically known as the Nanjing Massacre, or R-word of Nanjing. To this day, the number of deaths and the prevalence of R-word, torture, and looting by Japanese soldiers is hotly debated among historians and government nationalists on both sides. Like, how bad was it is very, nobody has really agreed on it, because it's a very dark thing that happened. So the Japanese attempts to downplay this and other massacres in Asia remain to this day a stumbling block in Japan's relations with many Asian nations. Like a lot of these Asian nations that they persecuted, they want Japan to be like, hey, yeah, I recognize that I did that thing. I am sorry. And oftentimes Japan does not do that. So it continues to be a point of contention. So this is what's happening in China, and it just gets worse. It just gets worse and worse, unfortunately. So what happens to change that situation? Dun, dun, dun. So tensions between Japan and the United States are intensifying. Like, the Americans are really alarmed by Japan's aggression in China, and they say, hey, Japan, stop being so aggressive in China. And Japan's like, no. So the diplomacy failed. And then the United States was still neutral during World War II. And that's essentially what's happening now. World War II is in full-blown gear. The United States is still neutral. And Japan does something which essentially it's going to regret. The United States decides to bar oil exports to Japan. So Japan is not agreeing to leave China alone. So the United States says, well, we're not going to give you any oil anymore. We're not gonna export it to you, and that is a crucial blow. Like when you're having a huge military campaign, oil is incredibly necessary, right? All of your machines run on oil. So the Japanese forces struck at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which you see this image here of the destruction, part of the destruction, and this attack damaged much of the United States Pacific Fleet, and it brought the U.S. into the war. So despite initial success, the tide started to turn against Japan at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, when much of its carrier fleet was destroyed. So Japan had overextended itself. It had invaded a whole bunch of little islands, it had taken a lot of things, and it was spread thin, essentially. And the Allies were like, well, we're gonna stop you. So over the next 3 years, it was subjected to an island-hopping counterattack by the Allies. So essentially the Allies had to go island by island in the Pacific, rooting out the Japanese. So this took 3 long years. But by mid-1945, Japan was preparing for a final Allied assault on the homeland. So the Potsdam Declaration called for the unconditional surrender of Japan, and they ignored it. They were like, no, we're gonna get ready for you to invade our homeland. And like everyone knew that was gonna end badly, right? Like there was no way that was gonna go well. And the US started firebombing Japan, so you had whole cities that were destroyed by these firebombs and killing, hundreds of thousands of people already, and Japan refused to surrender, even though it was looking really bad, right? So what happens? The Allies decide, like, well, we can do something else. Like, we don't want to do this attack on the homeland, so we're going to drop atomic bombs. So on August 6th, the United States released the world's first atomic bomb attack on Hiroshima, killing 90,000 civilians. Russia, which Japan had hoped would mediate between the Allies and itself. Russia had not declared war on Japan yet. And this whole time period of World War II, Russia had yet to declare war on Japan because it was honestly too busy trying to defeat Germany, and it was like, we'll deal with you later. We'll figure out, are you our friend or our foe later? And they declared war on Japan on August 8th. So the United States is particularly interested in ending this conflict as quickly as possible. The longer it goes on, the higher chance you have of the Russians coming down into Japan and occupying it. And then you're going to have United States forces, you're going to have the Allied forces coming into conflict with the Russian forces of like, who is in charge of this region now once you defeat it, right? So the United States is like, we need to be completely in charge. We don't want to deal with the communists, essentially, is what's happening. So on August 9th, Japan is still saying we're not going to surrender. So on August 9th, another atomic bomb was dropped, this time on Nagasaki, causing another 50,000 deaths. So the emperor formally surrendered on August 15th, 1945. And essentially, they surrendered to the United States, cutting off Russian claims to Japan, right? Basically, the United States won it, and they're in charge. So the terms of Japan's surrender to the Allies allowed the country to hold on to the emperor as the ceremonial head of state, but he no longer had authority. He could not be thought of as a god. He could not be thought of as divine. That was specifically said. And Japan was forced to give up its territorial claims in Korea and China. So these properties that it had taken previously at the end of World War I, things in Indochina and that kind of stuff, they had to give them all back, and all the stuff that they had taken in China, they had to give it back. Korea, they had taken, they had to give it back. In addition, America occupied the country under General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, known as the SCAP, a situation that would last until 1952, and until 1972 in Okinawa. So basically, the United States had control of Okinawa until 1972. Welcome in, Red Panda. How you doing today? So this is Hiroshima after the bomb. This is a familiar image. A lot of people have seen this, and that building in the center there still exists today as a reminder of the destructive, situation. And the destructive power, as I say in the caption, the destructive power of the bomb surprised even the scientists who had created them. They thought, okay, we're going to destroy the city center, that'll be it. Maybe they'll get the point. They did not realize how many people they were going to kill, right? And of course, you have the repercussions of radiation and things like that, which are going to kill people for decades and decades afterwards. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So MacArthur led the drafting of a new constitution, one that laid out the emperor's new role as a figurehead. In other words, he doesn't have any control over the military, that kind of stuff. And the Constitution dictated a separation of religion and state, which I mentioned before. And it extended suffrage to women, so women could vote now. And crucially, Article 9 of this Constitution, it renounced war. Basically, it said like Japan will never declare war again, which is an interesting concept, right? And it basically gave up its right to maintain a standing armed force. Like later on, they're allowed to have like a police force, like a militia, a state militia, but they're not allowed to have an armed force that like goes out internationally anywhere. So in 1951, a security treaty was signed by the United States and Japan that stipulated Japan would fall under the umbrella of U.S. military protection. So in other words, if Japan needs protection, the U.S. is obligated to protect it. And this is a treaty and a source of contention that remains to this day. It's like one hand, like, okay, you're going to protect us, but on the other hand, like, that causes a lot of issues, right? That means you can't protect yourself. And it means that the United States has to, like, deem it worthy that, okay, we will help you now. Like, how do you define that, right? How do you define when you need protection and help? So following the end of the occupation, Japan settled into a, if not happy, stable medium between the democratic ideals put forth in its new constitution, which is basically American created, and the top-down authority favored by the government's reigning conservatives. So you still had this conservative group of people who bristled at Japan's defeat. All of those people didn't disappear. You did have war criminals and people like that who were executed. A lot of people who were in the Allied forces believed that the emperor should be executed for war crimes, but America decided to keep the emperor as this like symbolic figurehead that like Japan had this person to like rally around. Still, they didn't want to kill him. And again, during World War II, like the emperor basically had to go along with what was happening in the military. The military really controlled the government and what was happening. He was just like, okay. So how much of the war crimes of World War II are really attributable to, the emperor Hirohito? Like, that's arguable. It's very arguable. So in 1955, the Liberal Democratic Party came into power. So you have these conservatives that were eventually pushed out. People who were mad that they lost the war. These people are pushed out. And you have the Democratic Party, which comes to power. And they would rule Japanese politics with few breaks until the present day. And they are have a very close cooperation with career bureaucrats and big business. They're interested in keeping the economy going, which it's not always had the best of luck in Japan. It does, and then it doesn't. So World War II ends. So who is this guy? Who is this sexy beast? And what does he have to do with atomic bombs? Anybody paying attention? Anybody still there? Anybody having ideas? Yeah, I was paying attention. It is Godzilla. It is Godzilla. Super sexy. Some poor man standing there in this really elaborate latex suit, struggling to breathe, while he pretends to be this massive monster. So any ideas about what he has to do with atomic bombs? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? 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 Godzilla has been dubbed the King of the Monsters, and it is a phrase first used in Godzilla, King of the Monsters film in 1956. He's the result of radioactive waste. He represents the atomic bomb. Yeah, like many, yeah, but kind of both of those together. But yes. So, King of the Monsters, 1956, that's the Americanized version of the original film. Godzilla is an enormous, destructive, prehistoric sea monster that is awakened and empowered by nuclear radiation, right? So you have these bombs that go off, everything gets irradiated, and he gets woken up by this nuclear radiation. So there's, a lot of different interpretations of Godzilla, but some have suggested that he's a metaphor for the United States, right? Like you woke this giant beast from its slumber, and then it takes terrible vengeance on Japan. So you did things, like you had the gunboat, why do I say gunboat? Gunboat diplomacy of Perry. So the Japanese are like not really great friends with the Americans. They're like, well, you came over and you forced us to open our ports. And then they're like, okay, well, we're going to go kick your butt at Pearl Harbor. And then you wake up the United States. They join the war because of Pearl Harbor. And you have, the horrible destruction of the atomic bombs. And all of the, also, deaths during the whole campaign, the whole Pacific Theater campaign. There's a lot of deaths and, bad things happening. So Godzilla is a romanization, in other words, like a westernization of Gojira, and that is the Japanese portmanteau of gorilla, which is gorilla, and Kujira, which is whale. So it's basically gorilla whale is what this is. So that's where Godzilla comes from. So but definitely like the negative side of atomic power, right? When things go wrong. And of course, Godzilla, he transforms later on into like an anti-hero where he starts, fighting other monsters that, start to destroy things. And then he comes in and fights that monster and protects humanity. But really, initially, he is, he's like a tornado that comes in and like, you can't control him. He's just going to destroy everything. But, that's often how stories work. They change over time. The hero becomes the anti-hero, becomes the protagonist, becomes the antagonist again, becomes the villain, back to becoming the hero. Astro Boy, yes. This is the Mighty Atom, or aka Astro Boy. He was created by Tezuka Osamu. So this is Tetsuwan Atamu, which is Iron Arm Atom. And he started as a manga, and then he became a world-famous anime waifu type. And this very famous character is nuclear fission-powered weaponized robot. And it's the idea of taking the power of the atom to save and help humanity rather than destroy. So we don't have this like ancient dinosaur sea monster thing coming along and like completely destroying a town and everyone in it. You go to the opposite end and think maybe there's positive sides of this nuclear age, right? Maybe it's not all bad. So this is a metaphor for the positive potential of nuclear reactors. So we'll talk about Tezuka a bit more. Obviously, he has a lot of different, manga, anime connected with him. But this is, particularly along this time period, like the atomic age for Japan is both good and bad, right? Like bad things happened. But can there be good out of out of atomic power? Can there be good out of it? And of course, obviously, this kind of imagery and storytelling is like, no, we can actually turn this around and help humanity with them. So the opposite of Gojira. Okay, moving forward a little bit here. So this is Sasaki Sadako. Often abroad, she is known as Sadako Sasaki. Obviously, like, we have this ongoing issue between, like, the Japanese put the last name first and the first name last, and, you know, when you read things in English, you're not sure, like, which name are you using? Which order of name are you using? You know this story. A lot of people know this story, but not everyone does. So you might go to Japan, and you might go to places like Hiroshima and see sculptures of this, like, young girl. You might see images of these cranes, these paper cranes, and things like that. And if you don't know, you're just gonna be like, why are all these things? So this is an image of Sasaki this is a bronze sculpture of her. So she was 2 years old when the bomb in Hiroshima was dropped. She was thrown out of a window during the explosion. Her mother thought she was, like, definitely dead, but she somehow survived that. But in 1954, she develops signs of leukemia, and this is caused by the bomb's radiation. So she is one of many, many children, particularly children, for some reason, would be affected by the radiation in this way. A lot of people just, you know, very quickly died because of the radiation. Other people who were not as close to the epicenter of the bombs, they died later. So the leukemia rates in Japanese children from the southern region soared at this time period. So supposedly she folded 1,000 cranes to get her wish granted when she was hospitalized. Like, basically they told her she's got a year to live. So she had heard someone tell her, like, oh, if you fold 1,000 origami cranes, you'll get your wish. Your wish will come true. And this is an image of her in reality. As she looked before she got super sick. So this is the Children's Peace Memorial in Hiroshima. So you can go there now and see it. And it's a statue of Sadako holding the golden crane above her head. And again, this is kind of image you might show up there and be like, what is this? What is happening here? So Sasaki and the cranes have become a symbol for world peace, showing the impact of nuclear war and the cost for innocent victims. So these origami cranes basically are going to be perpetually connected to her. You know, this leukemia, the death of so many Japanese children at this time period, and of course the impact of the atomic bombs. So you can see that in Hiroshima today. Okay. Moving along. And it's something a bit happier than that. So in the 1950s, we have the boom years. Japan took off on a trajectory of phenomenal growth that is often described as miraculous, though it was really jump-started by U.S. procurement of goods and supplies for the Korean War. So in the 1950s, you had the Korean War happening, where essentially you had, you know, the communist and democratic powers vying for control of the Korean peninsula, and of course, you know, the United States is occupying Japan, so they're just using it as a stopover place to go to Korea. So throughout the 1960s, Japan's GDP grew on average 10% a year, which is very good. And then a new consumer class began to grow, and it's inspired by images of affluence introduced during the American occupation, right? You have all these Americans there, and with Americans come American imagery, American movies, magazines, music, all of these things. And Japanese began to yearn for the so-called three sacred treasures of the modern era, which is a play on the three sacred treasures of the imperial family. There's three sacred treasures that are given to each emperor. They are a sword, a mirror, and a jewel. And for the modern era, it was commonly advertised as the three sacred treasures of the refrigerator, the washing machine, and the TV. So you can see one of the advertisements, 1964, for the Toshiba color television. Like, buy this today. You can see the Olympics, the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, in color if you purchase this thing. So by 1964, 90% of the population in Japan had all three of these things. So you're coming out of like your half of your country being firebombed, you know, two of your major cities being completely wiped out by atomic bombs, and by 1964 you're hosting the Olympics. Everybody has a fridge, a washing machine, a television. Like, you're doing much better, obviously. So the 1964 Tokyo Olympics were seen by many as a turning point in the nation's history, the moment when Japan finally recovered from the devastation of World War II to emerge as a fully fledged member of the modern world economy. So growth continued through the 1970s and reached a peak in the late 80s when wildly inflated real estate prices and stock speculation fueled what is now known as the bubble economy. These were heady times when it seemed like all the hard work of the post-war decade had paid off. Many Japanese went overseas for the first time, famously snapping up Louis Vuitton handbags by the armful. It seemed like things could only go up until they didn't. So I just love this advertisement of like the Japanese guy, and I guess this is a French guy, and he just like looks so evil. He looks so evil. He's gonna eat the ear off the Japanese man. Like, is this supposed to be like two happy sports people doing sports things during the Olympics? Like, someone needs to redraw this. But it shows you an interesting example of an advertisement for this time period. Okay, moving right along. The Heisei era. So we moved out of, those were the Taisho and the Showa eras. We moved into the Heisei era. And the eras are really determined by who is the emperor. So every time you get a new emperor, you get a new era name. That's how it works nowadays. That's not how it works during like medieval times, but nowadays that's how it works. So Heisei doldrums. So in 1991, just 2 years after the Heisei Emperor Akihito ascended the throne, you can see Crown Prince Akihito here with his wife Michiko on their wedding day, and the current Emperor Showa and Empress Kojun seated next to them. So this is 1959, and then basically, you know, from the late 80s is when he actually gets enthroned. So the bubble bursts of the economy. It goes down in a complete tailspin. The 1990s were christened the lost decade, but that has since turned into, like, you know, 3 decades, going into 4 decades. You get some articles nowadays that, like, oh, the Japanese economy is bouncing back, but, like, is it? I don't know. I don't know. Is it? It continues to slump along with little growth. Maybe in a couple more years we can actually see, like, is it actually bouncing back? Despite a lot of government intervention, so longtime Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's so-called Abenomics plan included devaluing the yen, and it had some positive effects on corporate gains, and it also, you know, positively affected inbound tourism. It made Japan a cheaper place to visit for international people. The yen, like, was not as expensive, right? So you could do more in Japan for your money. And it generated some, like, Japan is back, you know, economy is doing well. But ordinary people have seen very little change. You know, the parents enjoyed this boom economy of the 80s, and everybody's just kind of like, no, I don't see that anymore. So by now, a whole generation has come of age in Japan where lifelong employment, i.e. you're going to be employed by a company for your whole life, it's not guaranteed anymore, right? You may lose your job. You may have temporary employment. You may have a contract. You may have a job for a day, you know, that kind of stuff. It's no longer guaranteed, and that really supports the middle class. If you know you have a job to go to every single day that's going to pay you the same amount of money, then you can actually function as a middle class, and that really doesn't exist in Japan today. You're learning about that in macroeconomy? Oh. So there have been, so this is like, you know, the two emperors. And then moving forward in our history, we have some, you know, bad things that have happened, of course, as with any time period in any world history. Other disturbing troubles in Japanese society. So the economy isn't doing super well right now. Also in the 90s, in March 1995, members of the Shinriko doomsday cult released nerve gas on crowded Tokyo subways, killing 12 people and injuring more than 5,000. And here you can see workers cleaning the train car after this attack, the sarin attack in March of 1995. And then, so you have these like weird undercurrents happening, and then you also have, you know, devastating earthquakes like the one that happened in Kobe, also in 1995, that killed more than 6,000 people, and it really like signaled like a, you know, not happy times, right? Like the 80s were done, the boom economy was done, the bubble had burst, like bad things are happening. Also, there were several successive corporate scandals in Japan. And then, of course, in 2011, we have the earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear plant meltdown that we talked about previously. So it's all underlining that, like, things are a bit fragile, right? Like, infrastructure is fragile, economy is fragile. Like, can we actually get back to a point where we were in the 80s? Probably not, but it's interesting to think about. And then the Heisei emperor, who we saw in the previous slide, he decides to abdicate in 2019, and a Japanese emperor had never abdicated ever, you know, in our known history. Sometimes emperors were like assassinated or killed or pushed out of power or whatever, but to have that kind of abdication here in the modern era, they're like, well, what do we do? So his era came to a close, and a lot of people are hoping, okay, 2019, new era, new emperor, things are going to turn around. And now we have the Reiwa period. So since 2017, there have been signs of a recovering, growing economy in Japan. You know, if you look at some of the articles in like the New York Times about Japan, they'll talk about like the economy is coming back. But really, a lot of people in the younger generations are hesitant to spend money. Like they grew up without money, and they're like, well, I'm just going to save what I make because I'm not sure if I'm going to have a job like tomorrow, right? I'm not going to take a 2-week vacation and like blow all my money in Thailand and then come back and find that I don't have my job anymore or something, you know? They're very hesitant to spend money, and this stifles economic growth. Like if they're not going out to the stores and just buying things, it's going to have, you know, economic repercussions. If they're, you know, penny pinching and saving everything they make, how do you have economic growth? It's also struggling, Japan is also struggling with its international role. So, you know, how does it work within that peace constitution with the United States? Can it have a standing militia? How much of an armed force can it create? How much can it protect itself? How much does it rely upon the U.S.? And can it rely upon the U.S. if something bad actually happens? Including things like North Korea. You know, like if something happened with North Korea, can Japan depend on the United States to defend it, to help it? You know, these are questions that are constantly brought up. And of course, no one knows the answers, right? Until the poop hits the fan, no one really knows the answers to things. It also has difficult relationships with its unpredictable neighbors, such as North Korea and China. So China's economy completely surpassed Japan's in 2010. China's economy is number 2. United States is number 1. So, you know, you have something that's becoming very powerful right next door to you. And you can't have an army, right? The Chinese army is gigantic. Chinese military force is gigantic, and you can't have one, right? And then there's the North Koreans, who supposedly have all sorts of armed weapons and things like that. And they're right next door, and you can't have your own forces, armed forces. Like this is like, it's a bit of a tense kind of situation, right? So, and of course, the relationship with the United States is rather unpredictable. Like depending on who is in charge in the U.S., you know, and whether or not they're sane or insane, like that kind of throws it up in the air. Like, how is the U.S. actually going to help us, or are they going to, you know, be detrimental to us? but the U.S. is Japan's largest trading partner, and it relies on it for national security. So it's a very interesting relationship there. So that is something that's happening today and continues in the modern era of like, how are these relationships with their neighboring countries going to go down? So now we are in the Reiwa period. It is the current era of Japan's official calendar, as you can see here. It began on May 1st, 2019, the day in which Emperor Akihito's elder son, Naruhito, ascended the throne as the 126th Emperor of Japan. So the day before, Emperor Akihito abdicated the chrysanthemum throne, and it marked the end of the Heisei era. So this is where we're going to end it today. What does the Reiwa era hold for Japan and the rest of the countries in Asia, and even, what is our relationship? What is the United States' relationship with Japan? Yeah, a lot of things might change during this time period. But there is that the man and his son, power moving from one person to another. And, this abdication and the taking of the throne by Naruhito, it has brought up a lot of issues because Naruhito doesn't have a son. So the question is, he's got a daughter. So the question is, like, if he passes away, or like, who does he give the power to, right? So there are male people in the line that, like, but it would be much farther departed. And when from the main family, and when the new constitution and stuff was drafted with General MacArthur, they, the U.S. specifically cut off huge sections of the imperial family. They reduced the amount of people that could actually succeed to the throne, because they were trying to minimize the amount of infighting of, like, who could control the court, who would be the next emperor. So they're like, this is the small pot of people who are going to be potentially, emperors in the future, and have children who could then be emperors. So because that happened, that reduction of the actual imperial family, that means there's less people, right? There's less people to actually produce the babies that may then take the throne. So, in the current law, only a man can be in charge of the chrysanthemum throne. So it brings up an interesting issue of, like, in the future, will they allow an empress? Will they allow a female to take the throne? Will they change the laws to bring in a different male heir? Like, how is this going to go? So that, or, there's the other discussion, of course, of, like, maybe we should just let this imperial line die. Like, currently is the longest running imperial line in the world. So it'd be kind of a tragedy that it would end. Just, for historical value, it's very interesting and fascinating, and I think it's an important part of Japanese identity and culture. And that's one of the reasons why the Americans decided to keep it, because they knew how important the emperor and the imperial family were to the Japanese people. But, like, do you end it? Like, in the modern era, is there a room to have an emperor? Even if they're a figurehead, they don't really have a lot of governmental control, and they don't control the military anymore. Like, should you have an emperor? Is there a place for these people in the modern world? It's an interesting question, but one that will be determined perhaps in our lifetimes. Will they put another person on the throne? Will that guy be on the throne for a whole lifetimes? I don't know. It's very interesting. Will we see an empress? I would like to see an empress on the Japanese throne, but how the Japanese will feel about that, I don't know. Alright, so I know not everyone is actually still here anymore, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I know I just talked for 75 hours, or 3 hours, 3 hours, my God. If anyone has any questions, let me know. I'll find somebody to read. T-Pay is definitely not going to be on yet, because it's only 6 o'clock. But my voice is gonna stop working soon, so I can't keep going. Definitely need to rest. Alright. No questions from you. Okay. 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 There's nobody on. There's nobody on. I've had that happen before where I end at 6 and like nobody's on, or I end at 5 and nobody's on. When I try to end at weird times, nobody's on. That's okay though. I know a lot of you guys are lurking and stuff, so I think 8 p.m. tonight, Tifa will be continuing Professor Layton, so you can join me there. I'll be hanging out and harassing him as much as possible. Hopefully he needs a lot of hints and stuff, so he'll need to depend on a lot of rice juice, I think, hopefully. Fingers crossed, there's a lot of rice juice. And then tomorrow, we'll play a game. You went through a bunch of history today. Are you doing more lectures with more detail? Yeah, this was basically the second half of the history lecture. It was a long second half to give you a drive-by of the history. And then the next lectures are going to be more specific to, you know, aspects of Japanese culture, words that you might not know as we travel through Japan. So we'll try to take a more geographic approach, learning about things that you can see there, and, you know, and then learning about history and culture as we sort of travel through Japan together. So kind of like taking a travel guide and moving through it together in the lecture. So this won't be the last lecture. This is just the end of the introduction to history, so that, you know, if you remember all the stuff I talk about when I mention things in the future, they're not like completely out of left field and you're like, I didn't know there were atomic bombs dropped in Japan, which of course you guys probably already know that already, but that kind of stuff. So yeah, this is just history, basically the end of the history for now, and then we'll do more traveling throughout Japan, learning about visual culture, society, history, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, and then tomorrow I think we'll play some game. I'm not sure which game, but obviously it took me a while to make this PowerPoint. I don't have another PowerPoint ready for tomorrow, but in the future I'll have one created. I might work on like a little bit of Tokyo and then go to other cities and towns. Like if I just go from Tokyo, it'll take me like 7 years to go through Tokyo, so I might jump around different points or start in smaller cities and things like that. Tokyo is obviously the most fascinating city, but you know, you could spend 7 years talking about Tokyo and never see anything else. So and we'll probably, you know, some of the historical points that we brought up in the names and things like that and the eras and the periods we'll bring up more as we travel through Japan together. So yeah, tomorrow will probably be a game in the afternoon. I'm not sure which game, but a game. Okie dokie. So this is it for today, and hopefully I'll see you guys tonight in T-Face stream at somewhere around 8 o'clock or whenever he feels like starting. Thank you everyone for coming and listening. I hope you learned some stuff. This will be on the YouTube channel later. There's a link to the YouTube on my main page on the Twitch in case you want to find this. I've been making playlists of the games and the themes, so this will be in the theme for the Japanese lectures. I tried to make a specific playlist for that. I haven't really updated all the playlists super well, but this will definitely be assigned to that playlist and not in amongst all of the silly, ridiculous games I've been playing. So I hope you learn a little bit, and if you missed anything, maybe you can watch the replay on YouTube or watch the VOD. And if you have any questions in the future, feel free to ask me. Alright, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for coming and chatting with me. I hope you enjoyed this. Bye-bye. Was very interesting. Bye. Thank you. I'm glad you liked it. History of anime next. Maybe I'll do that. I don't know if you can hear me. Let's say maybe. History of anime. Soon. History of anime is very long and involved. A lot more than you think. But thank you for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.